Chapter 1569. Who says brothers have to be related by blood? The creature roared at this moment. Plus, hearing this, Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. He had been thinking about true brothers for a while, but he forgot that there was such a thing as sworn brotherhood in this world. However, judging from the crudely developed state of civilization in this world, it was truly a surprising thing for sworn brothers to appear. It was understandable that he could not think of it at the moment. In that case, it is indeed possible that you are. Luo Fan nodded and said. His reaction made the creature overjoyed. It looked as if it had grasped the last straw and said, "That's right. If you kill me, my elder brother will definitely avenge me. When that time comes, you will definitely die without a burial place. So, if you're smart, you should let me go now." Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly. This creature's intelligence was indeed quite average. Did he really think that at this point he would let him go just because of this threat? It was not about whether his elder brother was real or not. Even if his elder brother existed, it was very doubtful how strong he was. Tens of thousands of times stronger. This kind of words could only be listened to. It was like in the secular world in the past. If a certain expert wanted to shirk a certain task, he would usually say, "Go find so-and-so. His ability is 100 times stronger than mine." In reality, the recommended so-and-so might be weaker than himself, although the situation of the creature in front of him was different. But it was not much different. It was just that the difference was tens of thousands of times, but its credibility was also doubtful. After all these thoughts flashed through his mind, Luo Fan smiled and said, "I was just thinking of looking for more experts. If you really have such a powerful elder brother, that would be even better." As he spoke, he suddenly increased the strength of his palm. In an instant, with a soft poof, he had already crushed the shield in front of the creature that could turn into ice. In an instant, it directly bombarded the creature. The endless lines and runes that appeared on it directly wrapped the creature from all directions. Before the creature could even say a word, it had already turned into a statue and was sealed tightly. The other creatures were originally inexplicably hopeful because of the conversation between the creature and Luo Fan. They thought that there was hope for this matter to pass. However, they did not expect Luo Fan to suddenly turn hostile and attack. How could they gather their strength in such a short time? How could they really put up a strong resistance against Luo Fan's attack? However, each and every one of them could not even condense the power to resist before. They were directly sealed by the lines and runes on Luo Fan's palm one by one. They directly turned into statues and appeared in front of Luo Fan. He grabbed it with one hand and shrunk it slightly, turning into a miniature form and appearing in the palm of his hand. At the same time, he took out the statue that he had put away earlier and placed it side by side with the 12 statues in his hand. It looked rather shocking. At this moment, Guei Shou thought to himself, "Actually, I once heard that he seems to have a very powerful elder brother." As a creature that was born with intelligence, Guei Shou knew more than Shun Qingyi and Yu Ji, who were transformed by Luo Fan. At this moment, seeing that Luo Fan had dealt with the creature so straightforwardly, Guei Shou nervously told him what he had heard. "That's good. I also want to meet that even more powerful creature," Luo Fan said with a smile. Guei Shou sighed when he saw how confident he was and said, "Moreover, I heard that there seems to be an organization behind his older brother, and there are many beings who are as powerful as his older brother, or even more powerful than him. If we offend one of them, we will offend a lot of them. By then, the situation will be very bad." Hearing this, Luo Fan shook his head with a smile and said, "No matter how many enemies there are, it's just trouble for me now. There is no essential difference." Guei Shou opened his mouth, but couldn't say anything. At this time, Luo Fan was not as calm as he looked. However, this kind of uneasiness was not fear, as Guei Shou had expected. On the contrary, it was excitement, a kind of joy. Since he entered this world, what Luo Fan had done was to explore and search by himself. His understanding of the innate intelligence in this world was only limited to their primitive and crude nature. He had never come into contact with anything related to the Gene Emperor. If there was nothing related to the Gene Emperor in this world, there was no way it could be passed. After all, the Gene Emperor forcibly sent him here from the outside world. If he really had nothing to do with this world, it would simply be an insult to his intelligence. In this case, the result was obvious. The reason why he didn't come into contact with the things related to the Gene Emperor was that what he had come into contact with was not advanced enough and was still not the core of this world. After understanding this, it was easy to imagine his attitude towards the highly intelligent beings that could form an organization. Although he was excited, Luo Fan was quite calm on the surface. He turned his head and asked Qing Yi and Yu Ji, "How is the reinforcement of your world?" I've only completed around half of it." Qing Yi and Yu Ji appeared quite ashamed as they spoke. At this moment, the two of them were already feeling extremely regretful for opening up so many worlds back then. If they had opened up one less world, it would have been completed by now. If they were smart enough, they wouldn't need to open up so much time, and they would even be saved from all the trouble. Hearing their words, Luo Fan nodded and said, "Then continue to stay here." While they were talking, the independent space-time formed by the inexplicable power of the 13 creatures gradually collapsed. It gradually merged with the space-time of the outside world and returned to its normal appearance. Although the battle in that space-time was so intense that it could destroy the world countless times in the outside world, only a few dozen miles of the world changed. It seemed that there was only a deep pit here. Compared to the original grand and vast scene in the independent world, it was countless times worse. Even for this grand and vast world, it was only a kind of insignificant damage. According to the state of the world, it could be predicted that the deep pit would soon close and disappear. Eventually, it would completely return to its original state. At this time, Luo Fan and the others only glanced at the changes in this area. They didn't care about it anymore. Luo Fan was even more decisive. He directly lifted his feet and stepped lightly. In the blink of an eye, he had returned to the center of the civilized country, which was the palace that Qing Yi and Yu Ji had opened up on the peak. Because this civilized country was getting stronger and stronger, the area that it occupied was getting wider and wider. At this moment, this mountain peak was originally the main area of the civilized country. Unknowingly, it had already become a holy land that only Luo Fan and the living beings he had directly and indirectly created could stay in. The other living beings created by these many living beings could only survive outside of this mountain peak. They could only admire this mountain peak from afar. The creatures in the worlds that Qing Yi and Yu Ji had opened up were naturally an exception. Because of this change, Luo Fan didn't need to worry about being disturbed in the palace on this mountain peak. After returning to the palace, Gue Shou soon appeared in front of Luo Fan. Following that, Qing Yi and Yu Ji also appeared. "What I need to do?" After Gue Shou appeared, he asked Luo Fan in a daze. Luo Fan smiled and said, "Do whatever you want. If you're really bored, you can also create a creature to strengthen this civilized country." Create a creature? After hearing this, the daze in Gue Shou's eyes disappeared and turned into an inexplicable light. It seemed that he was suddenly full of fighting spirit. "No, this will start a war," Qing Yi hurriedly shouted. In the past, the strength of the various races in this civilized country was equal. The addition or loss of a race would not have much impact on the situation of the entire civilized country. At most, it would become more chaotic or less chaotic. If at that time, Qing Yi and Yu Ji would obviously only feel happy because the creation of creatures by Gue Shou had increased the degree of brilliance and would not have any other special feelings. However, the situation was different now. At this time, the civilized country had already stabilized. At this moment, the creatures they had created had already crushed the other creatures with an absolute advantage and occupied a dominant position. This civilized country had completely stabilized. Under such circumstances, a high-level race suddenly appeared out of nowhere, a living being that could challenge their position as the main character of the living beings they had created. The result was obvious. It would only disrupt this hard-won stability. It would directly start a war for the leading role. Moreover, it would be a war that would never end. It would only end when either one of the two sides was completely annihilated. Hearing this, Yuji seemed to wake up from a dream. He hurriedly shook his head and said, "Yes, yes, yes. Please don't. If you do that, this civilized country may be destroyed." Compared to Ching-yi, Yuji's intellect was slightly lower. However, after all, he had already gone through such a long period of training. Compared to the past, he was more than 10 times stronger. He quickly understood what Ching-yi was worried about. At this moment, his expression was as anxious as one could imagine. Originally, Guizhou was only interested in Luo Fan's suggestion. He even had other ideas to choose from. However, seeing how anxious Ching-yi and Yuji were, he made up his mind and said, "What are you talking about? In order to avoid a war, don't you want to increase the power of this civilized country? If this civilized country continues to spread like this, it will be stopped one day. By then, if it is not strong enough, won't it die? Who said that this country will not increase its power without the creatures you created?" Ching-yi was unhappy when he heard this. He shouted, "That's right. Don't you see? Compared to when this country first appeared, the power of this country has increased by tens of thousands of times. Moreover, it is not the end yet. In the future, this power will increase faster and faster until it reaches its limit." Yuji echoed. Guizhou said, "It will continue to increase?" "That's right. However, where is the limit of this increase? Is it 100 times, 1,000 times, or 10,000 times? But if I add the creatures I created, its limit, it can be increased by at least 10,000 times. Is there a need to talk about who is strong and who is weak? In short, it won't work." Ching-yi could not think of a rebuttal at this time, so he said this directly. "It's not up to you to decide." Guizhou chuckled at this moment. He had suffered quite a bit at the hands of Ching-yi and Yuji. At this time, he found an opportunity to make them unhappy. That made him feel so good that he did not even need to use it. They were arguing here. Luo Fan did not care about them at all. At this time, the sculpture had been completely put into his heaven and earth in his sleeve. In his hand, the flag that the crocodile refined into a magic treasure reappeared. His mind tightened, and he entered an inexplicable place that was similar to the origin of the realm. He continued to compare the combination effect of all kinds of true divine occult with the combination effect of the true divine occult in the origin of the realm to improve his worldview. At this moment, although his body seemed to be in this palace, it had almost completely integrated with heaven and earth. It was as if he had completely integrated with heaven and earth, becoming a kind of landscape, a kind of attribute, and a kind of rule that could not be broken at all. After arguing for a while, Ching-yi and the others could not convince each other. Just when they wanted to let Luo Fan judge for them and make a decision, they finally found that Luo Fan was already in a state that they could not understand at all. They could not help but feel discouraged. Guizhou was even more proud at this time, and he said, "Look, master is like this. It is obvious that his words are orders. You have to listen to him whether you want to or not." After staying with Ching-yi and Yuji for a long time, Guizhou had unknowingly been assimilated by them, and he actually called Luo Fan master. Hearing Guizhou's words, Ching-yi and Yuji wanted to refute, but in the end, they found that they could not find any powerful words to refute at all. It was not that there was no way to refute, but this kind of refutation might be disrespectful to Luo Fan. And this was something that they did not dare to do, nor were they willing to do. Guizhou almost won this argument by kidnapping Luo Fan. He immediately stepped out of the palace without hesitation and began to open his eyes to observe the civilized country, looking for the birthplace of the living creature that he had created. Since he wanted the living creature that he had created to become the protagonist of this world and occupy the absolute main body of this world, then the position of its appearance needed to be well planned. Ching-yi and Yuji appeared beside him at the same time, looking at him with an extremely unhappy expression. It was as if they would attack at any time and disrupt his means. Guizhou was not at all nervous about the appearance of the two of them. Although the status of Yu Ji and Qing Yi in front of Luo Fan might be a little higher than his, it was just a simple status. In terms of strength, he could absolutely crush them easily. Therefore, Gue Shou actually did not have to worry about the two of them destroying his plan. Here it is. Suddenly, Gue Shou laughed and said, looking at the place where his eyes were pointing, it was a deep mountain not far away from the civilized country. That was the place that the civilized country had not spread to. There used to be many living creatures living there, but at this moment, the number of living creatures had become extremely few. Although it could not be said that there were no living creatures, there was still a large enough living space for the newly born living creatures to use. Moreover, that place was easy to defend and difficult to attack. If there was a war in the future, the living creatures living there could definitely rely on their weaker strength to achieve the result of forcing the enemy to retreat. Qing Yi and Yu Ji's wisdom was quite strong after the experience, so they could see the advantages and disadvantages of that deep mountain at a glance. For a moment, their expressions changed slightly. When their expressions changed slightly, they saw that Gue Shou had already started to move. He lifted his foot and took a step. His body seemed to be swimming in time and space. It was easy and extremely elegant. Unknowingly, he came to the center of the forest. Qing Yi and Yu Ji naturally followed beside Gue Shou at the same time. They were only a few breaths behind Gue Shou, but they had already come to the center. Naturally, the two of them did not stand on either side of Gue Shou. Instead, they gathered together and stood not far away from Gue Shou. Both of them looked at him with a very unhappy expression. The more unhappy they were, the happier Gue Shou was. At this moment, it was as if he did not see the two of them at all. With a move of his heart, he raised his hand, and the true divine mysteries and great path fragments in the void began to gradually condense, as if he was knitting a sweater. He began to weave a funnel-like shape in the void. This kind of funnel weaved by the true divine mysteries and great path fragments, compared to the effect of Luo Fan's direct weave of the true divine supernatural power. Naturally, it was far inferior. The difference was extremely huge. However, compared to the ordinary true divine mysteries and great path fragments, such a weave had already combined their advantages and finally led to an inexplicable effect. In other words, it had completed the function that Gue Shou wanted. After the funnel was formed, Gue Shou did not hesitate. With a move of his heart, he opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of energy, which directly broke through the void and poured into the funnel. Then, through the countless true divine mysteries in the funnel, the energy was changed and bestowed. Finally, when the funnel came out from the bottom, it had already turned into living creatures. Each of them looked like a human. They seemed to have the same appearance as the living creatures that Qing Yi and Yu Ji had created. However, they looked more perfect and complete. As soon as these living creatures appeared, there were indistinct clusters of pitch-black clouds gathering in the void. In this cluster of clouds, there were indistinct and inexplicable sounds of thunder reverberating. That obviously had the charm of the shape transformation tribulation. Is this a predestined tribulation? Qing Yi and Yu Ji looked up at the sky with disbelief on their faces. How could this be possible? It was just the creation of living creatures. How could there be a predestined tribulation? Back then, they had created 30 million worlds, each of which contained endless living creatures. However, this did not cause any changes in the world. How could there be such a change in the world here, just because there were only a few hundred living creatures that Gue Shou had created? It was as if a predestined tribulation was about to befall this world. It's not a predestined tribulation. Although there's a hint of it, it's not to that extent. At this moment, Gue Shou spoke. His voice was filled with astonishment and excitement. Faintly, there was a feeling that he could not bear to look back on it. Although he seemed to disagree with Qing Yi and Yu Ji and had the intention to teach them a lesson, he did not actually bear a grudge against them. In fact, he was happy that he could communicate with these two people and bicker with him. At this moment, he naturally did not hesitate to explain his feelings to them. How could there be such a change? Qing Yi frowned and asked. As for whether it was a predestined tribulation, obviously, only Gue Sho, who had personally gone through the shape transformation tribulation, had the right to speak. A hint of understanding appeared in Gue Sho's eyes. He said, "Perhaps it's because the living creatures that I created have a born Taoist aptitude. Born Taoist aptitude." Qing Yi and Yu Ji repeated this term at the same time. Just this term alone was enough to infer many things. What kind of body could be called a Taoist aptitude? Moreover, it was a born Taoist aptitude. As they guessed, they cast their gazes on the living creatures that Gue Sho had created and began to analyze all the details of these living creatures in great detail. Just now, they were just unhappy that the creatures that Gue Sho had created had brought them trouble, so they did not pay much attention to the conditions of these living creatures. Thus, they did not feel much. At this moment, as they observed carefully, they gradually discovered the uniqueness of these living creatures. Although they were generally similar to the living creatures that they had created, almost every detail was subtly different from the living creatures that they had created. Chapter 1570. So this is born Taoism aptitude. Both Qing Yi and Yu Ji were inexplicably enlightened. Even though their bodies were billions of times stronger than the bodies of the creatures created by Gue Sho, and their power was beyond their imagination, they were still far more powerful than they could imagine. However, they could clearly feel that their bodies were inferior to born Taoism aptitude in many aspects. At least, this was the case when it came to their ability to integrate with the world. At this moment, the two of them simultaneously discovered a goal for their future cultivation from these creatures. That was to change their bodies into the appearance of connate Taoism aptitude. Of course, they had already lost the opportunity to directly take human form. The following modifications, no matter how compatible the modifications were with the requirements of born Taoism aptitude, they would no longer trigger the tribulation of form transformation, so naturally they would not receive the same benefits as Gue Sho. Even so, it was still an improvement. After all, it could make their connection with the world even closer, and they could receive more blessings from the world. With this mentality, the two of them fell silent almost at the same time. The two of them quietly looked at the creatures. They watched as they woke up from their days and began to thank Gue Sho. Then, they followed the teachings that Gue Sho had instilled into their consciousness. They searched for settlements, built houses, and looked for prey. At this moment, Gue Sho did not stop at all. After watching these living beings leave, they continued to create more and more living beings with born Taoism aptitudes. There were males and females among the creatures he created. However, they did not age, nor did they age. All of the creatures were in the prime of their lives. This was because when Luo Fan refined the crocodile into a magic treasure, the treasure spirit left a deep impression on him. As such, the creatures that he had created at this moment were born with extremely perfect reproductive abilities. Compared to the creatures created by Qing, Yi, and Yu Ji, who barely had the ability to reproduce, this kind of reproductive ability had an unimaginable advantage. Although the creatures created by Qing, Yi, and Yu Ji also had the ability to reproduce at that time, the world naturally gave them the appearance of the creatures they created, which was rather crude. It would take at least hundreds of years to reproduce a generation. In this way, obviously, they were very different from ordinary people. At this moment, the creatures created by Gue Sho were different. Before the creation of living beings, Gue Sho already had a concept about the reproduction of living beings. He was even shocked by the treasure spirit of the magic treasure refined by Luo Fan. Therefore, he attached great importance to the reproduction of living beings. With such a state of mind, this was a creature he had created. Procreate the next generation, the cycle of the cycle. Therefore, it had been reduced to 10 to 20 years. This, however, was already extremely close to the cycle of each generation of ordinary mortals. The reason for this. But it wasn't a coincidence. Instead, it was the structure of the born Taoism aptitude. Gue Sho bestowed the ability of reproduction to the creatures he created. Of course, it wasn't something that could decide how to reproduce or how long the reproduction cycle would be. Instead, It was set up according to the creature's body structure. As for ordinary mortals, although their essence had degenerated and they were no longer born Taoism aptitude, the cycle of life reproduction was deeply engraved in the depths of their life essence. Naturally, the cycle of reproduction was a state of one generation every 10 to 20 years. Guo Shou didn't directly create enough creatures to completely overturn the entire civilized country, although it was just a small effort for him. The number of living beings he created was only 129,600. Among them, half were male, and half were male, and half were male, and half were female, which was exactly the number of 1 yuan. The moment the number of creatures reached 129,600, the tribulation cloud that had been brewing above the void for a long time suddenly began to exert its power. There was a constant sound of thunder that was enough to shake the heaven and earth. This kind of thunder vaguely conveyed a kind of inexplicable joy, and the vibration that came from it was also more like the vibration that came from the body because of the laughter. "It's done." Guo Shou stopped and looked up at the sky. He vaguely found that behind the cloud, there seemed to be some kind of extremely strong light that was trying hard to penetrate the thick cloud. 129,600. This number was quite charming. With so many creatures, it was enough for this race to develop for a long time and steadily. In the end, it could even be predicted that they would even replace the current protagonist of the civilized country at this moment and become the absolute leader of the entire civilized country. When Guo Shou stopped moving, Qing Yi and Yu Ji had already noticed this. At this moment, they recovered from the process of comprehending the mystery of the born Taoism aptitude, and their faces were filled with conflict and helplessness. For them, the current civilized country could be said to be their painstaking effort. Seeing the creatures they created gradually decline and be gradually replaced by other creatures was definitely something that made them feel helpless. However, these newly born creatures had a great effect on them. Even without Guo Shou's protection, they probably couldn't bear to do anything to them. In this way, their conflict could be imagined. The cloud in the sky was indeed not a calamity. Above the void, there seemed to be a burst of thunder that sounded like the laughter of heaven and earth. After shaking the world for a while, the cloud gradually dispersed, and in the blink of an eye, a cloudless sky was revealed. Moreover, Guo Shou also saw the light behind the cloud at this moment. It was an extremely huge and perfect sun. Compared to the previous sun, this sun seemed to be rounder at this moment, and the light emitted from it was also more vivid. There seemed to be an inexplicable vitality in it. This was an unprecedented change. At this moment, Guo Shou knew that he had created an unimaginable race. The entire world would be completely changed because of this race, which was less than 129,600 at present. They would become a completely strange race. Thinking of this, Guo Shou was a little proud and happy, but also a little melancholic. Creating such a creature that could change the world was naturally something to be happy about and proud of. However, if this creature wanted to change the world that it was born and raised in, it was extremely familiar. Even the world that it dreamed of, that feeling would obviously not be too good. Perhaps I should remind those people. Qing Yi suddenly murmured. The people she mentioned were naturally the creatures that she and Yu Ji had created. Now, they had become the main characters in that civilized country. As for what she wanted to remind them, obviously, it was needless to say, the competition has to be fair. Guo Shou glanced at her. Guo Shou glanced at her and said calmly, "Humph, you've created those creatures so perfectly. Is that fair?" Qing Yi was furious. Qing Yi was secretly angry. That's just the difference in strength. I also relied on my own ability to create these creatures, and you also relied on your own strength. Under such circumstances, the creatures you created are not as perfect as mine. Isn't this something to be ashamed of? Why do you speak of it so confidently? Guo Shou chuckled. Hearing this, Qing Yi and Yu Ji didn't know what to say for a while. In fact, what Guo Shou said was correct. Creating more perfect creatures was not a reason that could be questioned at all. One must know that when they first created the creatures, Didn't they think that they could be as perfect as they wanted? Back then, they didn't care about the life and death of other creatures at all. Under such circumstances, wasn't it reasonable for Gui Shou to create more perfect creatures in front of them? Since they had already created these creatures, they naturally didn't need Gui Shou to intervene in the following matters. Immediately, Gui Shou, Qing Yi, and Yu Ji returned to the palace where Luo Fan was. After that, Qing Yi and Yu Ji didn't stay in the palace for too long. Soon, they left the palace and returned to the worlds they were in the process of strengthening. However, this time, they didn't start to strengthen those worlds with the help of materials. Instead, they started to experiment. Their experiment was very simple. It was to create creatures. If they weren't powerful enough, they wouldn't be able to create a more perfect being. Naturally, they wouldn't be able to do anything and could only watch as the protagonist of this civilized nation was replaced. However, after observing the process of Gui Shou creating creatures, they naturally understood that it wasn't a matter of not having enough strength to create. It was just a matter of whether their thinking was right or wrong. Since that was the case, how could they be willing to watch all this happen? However, it seemed easy, but it was difficult to do. Previously, they thought that they had already understood all the details of the born Taoism aptitude and understood it clearly. However, when they actually used it to create living beings, they discovered that the living beings they created looked very much like born Taoism aptitudes at first glance. However, if they looked closely, they would find that either something was missing here, or there, in short, they couldn't create born Taoism aptitude at all. Why is it so difficult? Yu Ji looked at the creatures in front of her, who seemed to be born Taoism aptitude at first glance, but in essence, they were just a little higher than the creatures they had created in the past. She couldn't help but feel discouraged. Qing Yi, who seemed to be at the back, also had an extremely ugly expression. Although she didn't say anything discouraged, her eyes became extremely agitated. It felt as if she could grab something at any time and start destroying it to vent her anger. However, compared to Yu Ji, she was still a little more rational. She saw a little bit of luck in this frustration that was close to a blow. Fortunately, we tested it first. Otherwise, if we directly used it on our own bodies, the results would be unimaginable. Hearing this, Yu Ji frowned and said helplessly, "Although this is indeed a bit of luck and misfortune, I can't laugh no matter how hard I try. If 10 times isn't enough, then 100 times. If 100 times isn't enough, then 1,000 times. I believe that if we continue, we will be able to create a real born Taoism aptitude one day." Qing Yi patted Yu Ji's shoulder, and her expression became quite determined. "However, I still feel that this born Taoism aptitude may have other secrets. If we continue to repeat this, I'm afraid there might not be too good of an effect." Yu Ji murmured, "Perhaps, but we still have to try, don't we? We've only tested it less than 10 times. It's still too early to come to a conclusion," Qing Yi said, still unwilling to give up. These words were obviously reasonable. However, Yu Ji couldn't find the words to refute. He could only nod his head. The born Taoism aptitude was exquisite and mysterious. Although there was a general outline, there were many details. They were all based on the situation of each living being. They were adjusted according to the environment. Under such circumstances, unless all the secrets of the born Taoism aptitude were fully understood, the living being created would at most be like the born Taoism aptitude. It was almost impossible to succeed. As for why Gui Shou was able to create living beings with the born Taoism aptitude so easily, the reason was very simple. It was because his body had already become a born Taoism aptitude. Under such circumstances, even if he did not grasp all the secrets of the innate Taoism aptitude, his body would instinctively adjust the various details of the creature he created when he created it, naturally making it fit with the innate Taoism aptitude. As such, the innate Taoism aptitude he created would naturally be a rather perfect innate Taoism aptitude. As for why he was able to transform himself into a natural Taoism physique at the very beginning, It was naturally because the various details of the natural Taoism physique that Luo Fan had imparted to him were directly constructed according to his situation and the surrounding environment. It was naturally very easy for him to construct it. Judging from this characteristic of the born Taoism aptitude, it could already be seen how unreliable it was for Qing Yi and Yu Ji to want to build a car behind closed doors and master the ability to create living beings with the born Taoism aptitude through repeated attempts. However, Qing Yi and Yu Ji naturally didn't know about this at the moment. At this moment, in this world, they tried to create living beings with the born Taoism aptitude again and again. The humanoid living beings appeared in batches and began to spread to every corner of this world, gradually enriching the rather monotonous race in this world. Although these created living beings were slightly different from those with the born Taoism aptitude, they still had the charm of the born Taoism aptitude overall. Moreover, due to some flaws compared to the born Taoism aptitude, these living beings were slightly unbalanced. However, each of them was born with all sorts of powers that were either strong or weak. These various powers allowed these living beings to be naturally differentiated from the living beings that already existed in this world. Gradually, they began to form an independent race that gradually grew and strengthened. They began to have disputes with the living beings in this world, causing friction and eventually going to war. Qing Yi and Yu Ji were unable to create living beings with the born Taoism aptitude after so many creations. However, it wasn't like they didn't gain anything. Through such creations, they gradually understood the characteristics of the born Taoism aptitude and understood what they were missing. So, what we need is inheritance. Qing Yi sighed and said to Yu Ji after creating a group of living beings that were the closest to the born Taoism aptitude since she started creating living beings. Inheritance. Indeed. Yu Ji was stunned for a moment. She reacted and looked a little excited. But who should we get the inheritance from? Could it be Gu Shou? Yu Ji frowned and said with an extremely ugly expression. It was obvious that she was extremely unwilling to do so. He's also quite unlucky. Qing Yi said at this moment, I think his born Taoism aptitude was also obtained through inheritance. I'm afraid he doesn't know the secrets of the born Taoism aptitude himself. He was able to create the born Taoism aptitude by relying on the convenience of his body being born Taoism aptitude. He can't give us the inheritance, Qing Yi said with a frown. After so many experiments, Qing increasingly felt the vastness and profoundness of the born Taoism aptitude. At this moment, she didn't believe that Gu Shou could understand everything and give them the inheritance. Then what should we do? Should we go to Master? Yu Ji said helplessly. Qing Yi was also a little troubled at this moment. The reason why Gu Shou could obtain the born Taoism aptitude was obviously because of their master, Luo Fan. At this point, both of them were quite clear about it and didn't have any doubts. However, knowing who had the inheritance of the born Taoism aptitude and who could give them the born Taoism aptitude did not mean that they could go and find it. Luo Fan was their master. How could a servant make a request to their master? Even if their master wanted to give them something, it was a reward from him. How could they ask for it? They didn't dare to make a request, but they were unwilling to give up just like that. Just looking at this moment, the ones they created were only close to the born Taoism aptitude. It wasn't even the advantage of the living beings with the born Taoism aptitude in this world. They could imagine how much of an impact the real born Taoism aptitude would bring to civilized countries when they grew up. After a while, Qing Yi gritted her teeth and said, Let's go to Master and wait. If there's a chance, we'll tell him. If there's no chance, forget it. Yu Ji's expression changed slightly. In the end, she still gritted her teeth and nodded. Since they had already agreed, the two of them didn't stay here. They directly stepped out of this world and came to the hall where Luo Fan was. When they arrived here, the two of them felt that there was something different about the hall. It turned out that Luo Fan, who seemed to have completely merged with heaven and earth and become an ethereal entity, seemed to have become a certain attribute of heaven and earth, no longer had that feeling. At this moment, he was floating in the air with a calm expression on his face. His eyes were closed, and the banner in his hand had been put away at some point in time. When Qing Yi and Yu Ji stood in the hall, there was a faint, inexplicable fluctuation coming from Luo Fan's body. This fluctuation was extremely subtle and disappeared very quickly. If Qing Yi and Yu Ji had not been paying attention to Luo Fan at all times, they might have already ignored this inexplicable fluctuation. After this fluctuation, the endless true saint mysteries and fragments of the great path and the surroundings started to surge slightly and faintly condensed around Luo Fan's body. It was like rings of light that appeared around his body layer by layer. They rotated slightly and faintly revealed an inexplicable grandeur. This made Luo Fan look so sacred. The rings of light condensed from the true saint mysteries and fragments of the great path did not last for too long. After a while, they disappeared without a trace. When this ring of light disappeared, Luo Fan slowly opened his eyes. There was nothing strange in his eyes. However, anyone who saw it would involuntarily be immersed in it. After seeing it, they would unconsciously think about it from time to time. It was as if there was an infinite hidden truth in it. Although there's an improvement, it's still far from enough. At this moment, this was what Luo Fan thought in his heart. At this moment, he had already used up the amount of time that the flag could support him to enter the existence similar to the origin of the realm. Therefore, he had no choice but to leave that state and leave that inexplicable place. The various true saint mysteries and mysteries that he had comprehended from the existence similar to the origin of the realm had completely disappeared the moment he left that inexplicable place. He had completely forgotten about it. However, in the process, the worldview of laws that he had perfected was preserved. To Luo Fan, the worldview of laws was his most crucial cultivation achievement. It determined what level his cultivation realm could be raised to and whether he could become a true saint in the future. In this way, it could almost be said that his gains from that inexplicable place had been almost completely preserved. When Qing Yi and Yu Ji came here, he was working hard to raise his cultivation realm through his worldview of laws so that his cultivation realm could grow to a level that was on par with his worldview of laws. All these strange phenomena had appeared because his cultivation realm had increased. At this moment, just as he thought, his cultivation realm had improved compared to before. However, compared to his ultimate goal of attaining the primordial chaos Tao fruit and becoming a true saint, he was still far from it. What's the matter? As he sighed, Luo Fan turned to look at Qing Yi and Yu Ji and asked. Chapter 1571. Qing Yi and Yu Ji were already prepared to wait for many years, but they did not expect that Luo Fan would have the time to take care of them as soon as they arrived. They were a loss for a moment and only reacted after a while. Qing Yi hurriedly stated her request. A little bit. Novel. X. Luo Fan looked enlightened when he heard this. He did not think much about what Qing Yi and Yu Ji would think after seeing the creature created by the turtle, but now that she reminded him, he immediately understood. He knew that after seeing the wonders of the born Taoism aptitude, they would certainly want to change their own bodies into born Taoism aptitude. Luo Fan was naturally not unhappy about this. After all, this was a piece of cake for him. He would not lose anything by giving them the born Taoism aptitude. Therefore, after hearing Qing Yi's request, he did not refuse. He nodded and said, "Since you want it, I'll give it to you. Originally, this would not mean much to you." As he spoke, he pointed his finger, and two beams of spiritual light rushed out of his hand. In the blink of an eye, they poured into the minds of Qing Yi and Yu Ji, and were completely integrated into their memories. These two beams of spiritual light contain a large amount of memories. Among them, the specific details and wonders of the born Taoism aptitude that were suitable for the two of them were clearly described, so that the two of them could easily adjust their bodies into the appearance of the born Taoism aptitude, according to the information within. Luo Fan had even experienced the wonders of the saint's body and understood the wonders of the born Taoism aptitude. Naturally, he would not think of anyone else. adjusting the various details of the born Taoism aptitude according to the state of their bodies was a piece of cake for him. After receiving this information, Qing Yi and Yu Ji instinctively thanked Luo Fan and were completely engrossed in the process. Through this information, the two of them had truly understood what they lacked in the construction of the born Taoism aptitude. For a moment, they felt like they had been enlightened, and the fog that had shrouded their minds had instantly dispersed. Go! Luo Fan waved his hand. The two of them hurriedly bowed and retreated. After leaving the hall, Yu Ji couldn't hide his excitement as he said to Qing Yi, "Great! I didn't expect Master to impart the method to build a born Taoism body to us so easily." "That's for Master. It was just a trivial matter. With Master's magnanimity, he will naturally not be stingy." Qing Yi also spoke with great joy. However, the situation in this country has become quite bad. Yu Ji glanced at the scenery of the civilized country at the foot of the mountain. He couldn't help but feel helpless. It had been a long time since the turtle longevity turtle had created this creature. Many years had already passed. Until now. The creature that Gue Shou created back then was already more than 100 times stronger than before. Their tentacles had already stretched out of the deep mountains, although they had yet to come into contact with the original living beings in this civilized country. But it wasn't that far off. At this time, the protagonists of the civilized country, the creatures that they had created, still felt nothing about this. They were still as arrogant and high-spirited as before. They didn't expect that a creature that could pose a great threat to them was rising. Don't worry. When we become born Taoism bodies ourselves, we will soon be able to create creatures that also have born Taoism bodies. When that time comes, this civilized country will once again be in our hands. After all, we have a huge advantage over the turtle longevity turtle. Qing Yi said. Hearing this, Yu Ji's expression softened a little. He snorted at the creatures that Gue Shou had created, who were exploring outside the civilized country. He turned around and stepped into one of the worlds that they had created. Out of sight, out of mind. Qing Yi sighed and also stepped into the world that Yu Ji had entered. Now, for them, the most important thing was to transform their bodies into born Taoism bodies so that they could receive the blessing of this world. Other than that, everything else was secondary. The world that the two of them stepped into was not the world that they had entered to test their born Taoism bodies. It was another world that had not been changed yet. After coming to this world, the world naturally seemed to be a little joyful because of their arrival. Although there were no tremors or strange phenomena, the feeling of joy could not be concealed at all. It was the joy of this world that made the two of them feel much calmer at this time. In fact, every world that they had created would feel joyful because of their arrival. That was why they had unknowingly created as many as 30 million worlds. It was also why they prefer to stay in these worlds instead of staying in the more advanced, grander, and vast worlds outside. Standing on the highest peak of this world, Qing Yi said to Yu Ji, "Let's begin. We need to speed up next. Otherwise, the turtle longevity turtle will have too much of an advantage." Hearing this, Yu Ji naturally nodded, and his expression became serious. Shape-shifting, they had all gone through this once. Although the bodies that they had transformed into back then were not born Taoism bodies, there would not be much of a change in their nature. Therefore, they were naturally very clear about the various dangers, difficulties, and traps during the transformation process. After carefully sorting out the construction method of the born Taoism bodies that Luo Fan had taught them in their memories, the two of them began to emit an inexplicable power at the same time. This power was insignificant to this world and the outside world. At most, it would only cause some strange phenomena in the space-time within a radius of tens of thousands of miles. However, in this world that the two of them had created, this power was so powerful that it was enough to shock everything. At this moment, the world trembled slightly and swayed slightly. Even the great Tao of this world made creaking sounds under this power. It seemed as if it could not bear the burden and was about to explode from the pressure of this power. It would completely collapse and turn into countless fragments of the great Tao. This kind of change was like the end of the world for the countless living beings in this world. For a moment, all kinds of inexplicable panic appeared in the hearts of all living beings. As a result, the world gradually fell into a kind of chaos and hysteria. At this moment, the joy that the world felt because of the arrival of the two of them seemed to gradually fade. It seemed to be gradually fading away, gradually returning to its normal appearance. Gradually, it treated Qing, Yi, and Yu Ji as an ordinary living being. It was fortunate that the two of them were the creators of this world. If not for the convenience of being the creators of this world, given the pressure that the two of them exerted on this world, the impact that the two of them had on this world, at this moment, the world would definitely hate the two of them. It might even give birth to countless tribulations to attack the two of them. Qing, Yi, and Yu Ji could not care about the changes in this world at this moment. At this moment, they were shrouded by a terrifying pain that they had never experienced before. In fact, it was something that the two of them had never imagined existed in this world. This pain was thousands of times more intense than the pain of crushing a person. In this pain, the two of them felt at the same time that everything in their bodies was being broken. They felt as if their life force was being disintegrated at this moment. The born Taoism aptitude was not just an external appearance. It also involved countless changes that went deep into the body, deep into the life force, and deep into the essence of life. It would have been fine if it had been directly constructed in the state of transformation. The state of transformation was originally a process of complete transformation from the inside to the outside. At that time, the transformation of the body toward the born Taoism aptitude would complement each other. There would be no pain at all. Instead, it would give the body a perfect template, which would give it an inexplicable sense of comfort. However, it was obviously a completely different situation if one wanted to transform their body into this state when they were not in the state of transformation. That would require one to completely shatter the original stable body structure and completely disintegrate the stable essence of life. If one were to destroy the originally perfect body, how could one still feel comfortable? What he felt was, of course, a boundless, horrifying pain that was enough to destroy everything in its path. In this unforeseen pain, Qing, Yi, and Yu Ji completely forgot about everything in the outside world. They only focused on the various details of the born Taoism aptitude that Luo Fan had taught them and that were completely suitable for them. They worked hard to reconstruct the body structure that they had just shattered according to the various details of the born Taoism aptitude. This process was so painful, so difficult, and so unbelievable. Time, in their perception, seemed to have become extremely slow. In a trance, it seemed as if billions of trillions of years had passed. The two of them finally broke away from the endless pain and felt an inexplicable sense of comfort in their hearts. The world, the earth, and even everything in the world seemed to have established an extremely close connection with them. They even vaguely felt that there seemed to be an existence that was even more vast and majestic than the world in some extremely special and mysterious place. However, this feeling was faintly discernible. Even if they exhausted all their power, they could not deepen this feeling in the slightest, let alone enter it to see what it was. What is that? Do you feel it? Qing Yi's eyes were a little lost as he looked at Yu Ji and said, I feel it too, but it's so blurry that I can't tell what it is at all. Yu Ji also said in a daze. The two of them felt the same thing. They both sensed that extremely vast and powerful existence, and they both tried their best to deepen that feeling, but they could not do it no matter what. After a while, Qing Yi sighed and said, I think it might have something to do with the ultimate move that Guei Shou and the others used. I don't know if I'm overthinking it. If we can't figure it out, perhaps we can ask Master, Yu Ji said straightforwardly. Compared to Qing Yi, who was a little more intelligent, Yu Ji's way of thinking was more direct. He did not beat around the bush. Therefore, sometimes the solutions that were suggested were more direct and effective. Hearing this, Qing Yi smiled and said, That's right. Master will definitely understand what we can't figure out. Moreover, I think that this matter should be of some use to Master. After that, the two of them noticed that the world had changed because of the two of them constructing their born Taoism forms here. At this moment, the world had long become barren. In the entire world, there were almost no living creatures. There were natural disasters everywhere. Desolation was everywhere. Cracks in space and time filled the world. These were the original chi that existed in this world. No one knew where they were. Such a world. It was hard to believe that it was still prosperous before Qing, Yi, and Yu Ji constructed their born Taoism forms. What happened? Yu Ji said in a daze. The world had become like this. It was something that she had never dreamed of. Qing Yi's face was also filled with shock and bewilderment. However, she was more rational than Yu Ji, and her thinking was more meticulous. Thinking back to what had happened before, she understood why the world had become like this. For a moment, regret appeared on her face as she said, "This is because of the power that leaked out when we were modifying our bodies. Apart from some of the living creatures that escaped from this world, the rest have all been killed by us." Killed? Yu Ji's face was filled with disbelief at first, but quickly turned ashen. Although they did not know how many living creatures had died under their power, judging from the number of living creatures that originally existed in this world, the scale was definitely not small. In fact, it would take at least hundreds of millions of living creatures to count. To Yu Ji, who had never seen more than 1,000 living creatures before she met Luo Fan, the impact of such a large number of living creatures dying in her hands was unimaginable. She did not know how to react for a moment. There's no need to think too much. Let's go see where the living creatures that escaped are. Although Qing Yi was also greatly shocked, the advantage of being able to bear it was that her endurance was higher than Yu Ji's. Even though her expression was ugly, she had already made a rational decision. Yu Ji still did not have much of a reaction. She was still immersed in the fact that she had killed an unknown number of trillions of living creatures, unable to extricate herself. Seeing this, Qing Yi did not wait for her to turn around. She lifted her hand and took a step forward. Her figure had already left this world, directly entering the world that she had detected before, the world that the living beings in this world had entered after leaving. This target world was a world that they had modified and reinforced before. The entire world was vast, and it was several times larger than the worlds that had not been modified and reinforced before. Such a world originally had about the same number of living creatures as the other worlds that had not been modified. Now that such a vast area had suddenly been added, it naturally became vast and sparsely populated. The living creatures in that world had moved here, but it did not make the world seem crowded at all. Looks like they're doing well. Qing Yi sighed when she arrived. This finally woke Yu Ji up from her state of being unable to extricate herself. She cast her gaze directly at this world, at the country that the living creatures from another world had built. Compared to this world, these foreign creatures were absolute outsiders. Although they were weak and could not be rejected by this world, they were definitely not lucky in this world. However, Qing Yi was not lying when she said that they were doing well. They were unlucky in this world, but this also encouraged their desire to become stronger, causing their current strength to be several times stronger than when they were in the original world. With such great strength, the country that they built was also extremely powerful. The place that they occupied in this world was a place that was extremely rich in resources, in terms of the number of living creatures alone. Now, it had already returned to the scale of the original world. This made Yu Ji suddenly feel as if she had returned to the past. She had returned to the original state before the two of them destroyed the world. For a moment, the feeling of being unable to extricate herself gradually subsided. Although she was still a little regretful, at least it was much better than before. After a while, Yu Ji, who had recovered, slightly sighed and said, "Back then, Master said that these living creatures might cause trouble for us after they died. I wonder if those living creatures will cause trouble for us if they died because of us?" Hearing this, Qing Yi shook her head and said, "The probability of that is very, very small. However, it doesn't matter. They cause us trouble, and this is what they should do. After all, we let them down. I actually hope that they can bring us some trouble. If that's the case, then we'll have to deal with them. If that's the case, I will feel better. Yu did not expect that the regret in Qing Yi's heart was no less than hers. She could not help but sigh. After Qing lamented, she smiled and said, "Now that we know that they're doing well, why don't we quickly transform that world? There's still quite a number of life imprints left behind in that world. Perhaps after we quickly modify the world, we will be able to find a way to destroy that world. Perhaps after we quickly transform the world, they might have a chance to reincarnate and be resurrected." The world that they created did not have a complete reincarnation mechanism. This kind of thing. Actually, the probability was very small. However, this was still a chance to slightly reduce the guilt in their hearts. This was already enough for them to take action. Immediately, Yu nodded and left the world with Qing Yi. They returned to the world that had become extremely dilapidated and seemed like it could collapse at any time. Towards the two of them, the world no longer had the same joy and excitement as before. In fact, it could not even maintain its normal calm. Instead, there was a faint disgust and a faint hatred. In fact, there seemed to be an indescribable negative karma gathering towards them, continuously melting away the heaven-opening merits that they obtained from opening this world. Karma and merit existed in every world and every world. They represented merits and destruction to the world. However, in some worlds, the rules of karma and merit were extremely strict. The attitude of the world toward karma and merit was also extremely obvious. The rejection of those who possess karma was extremely strong, but the support for those who possess merit was also extremely impressive. However, some worlds were different. There was a difference between negative karma and merits. However, it only manifested invisibly and seemed to be faintly discernible. It even made people wonder if there was a difference. It was precisely because different worlds had different attitudes towards negative karma and merits that the negative karma and merits of some worlds were so obvious, but some worlds seemed to not have them at all. However, this did not mean that some worlds really did not have merits or negative karma. It was the same in this world at this moment. Qing Yi and Yu's heaven-opening merits had always existed. The world was happy because of their arrival, and it was also because of the existence of this heaven-opening merit. Qing Yi and Yu's strength was even comparable to a false saint. Now that they had attained the innate Taoism aptitude, their strength had increased a lot compared to before. Naturally, they could clearly sense the merits and negative karma. They also knew how much damage they had caused to the world just now. For a moment, a hint of regret flashed through their hearts. The two of them looked at each other and sighed. Then, they began to release various materials according to the method that Luo Fan had taught them. They continuously integrated them into the world in front of them, continuously nourishing the world and healing the various cracks that existed in the world. With their actions, the world began to regain its vitality. The outline of the originally broken great path that seemed to be piled up with countless fragments gradually disappeared, and the countless cracks that existed within it were constantly mending. The law layer of this world also broke away from the inexplicable chaos and began to harmonize with the great path again. It returned to its original stable state and began to guide the four basic existences in the world: time, space, matter, and energy, to gradually evolve towards a stable state. An indescribable joy gradually emanated from the world. The negative karma that was constantly condensing towards Qing Yi and Yu began to gradually decrease during this process. Chapter 1572. It was not difficult for Qing Yi and Yu to repair the world. Top spot novels. Under their control, the entire world had transformed from its original dilapidated state into something even stronger and more stable than before it was destroyed in just a few days. The entire world was full of vitality, which covered almost every inch of land and every inch of ocean in the world. Perhaps it was because the two of them felt guilty towards this world, or perhaps it was because their powers had increased again after attaining born Taoism aptitude. Under their methods, this world was stronger and more stable than any other world that had been fortified. When Qing, Yi, and Yuji were recreating life in this world, they discovered something that made them feel pleasantly surprised. That was, this world retained more of the marks of the living beings that had died because of the leakage of their power than they had imagined. With these marks, when they created the living beings in this world, it was equivalent to resurrecting them. Moreover, because the two of them already had born Taoism aptitude, the living beings they created were easily turned into born Taoism aptitude. Therefore, the living beings that were resurrected through the marks were easily turned into born Taoism aptitude. Therefore, these living beings that had been resurrected through the marks were all born Taoism aptitude. Therefore, these living beings that had been resurrected through the marks were all born Taoism aptitude. Their potential was many times stronger than before. This had already saved them the trouble of having to create born Taoism aptitude again to compete with the Gui show. It was really killing two birds with one stone. When these living beings with born Taoism aptitude were born, the world began to inexplicably rejoice again. It was a kind of joy for the arrival of Qing, Yi, and Yuji. Moreover, the karma brought about by the damage they had caused to this world had unknowingly disappeared without a trace. For those living beings, it was difficult to tell whether they had made a loss or a gain after paying such a great sacrifice to obtain born Taoism aptitude. However, it was obviously different for this world. For the world, the death of some living beings did not matter at all. As long as the mechanism for the birth of living beings in this world was not destroyed, it was fine. However, the nature of the living beings that were born had become higher. From the appearance of ordinary living beings to born Taoism aptitude, this greatly increased the potential of this world, so that this world was qualified to pursue a higher level. This, for the world, this was obviously a great thing. In comparison, the loss of a few lives and the destruction of the world for a while was nothing. It was precisely because to the heavens and earth, the birth of a creature with a born Taoism aptitude was of great significance. That was why, since Qing, Yi, and Yuji had done all of this, the negative karma that they had accumulated from the damage they had caused to the world had naturally dissipated. Even, on the other hand, the merit of creation they had accumulated from creating this world seemed to have increased a lot. It's finally done. Yuji let out a long sigh as he sensed the changes in the world. An indescribable joy appeared on his face. The guilt in her heart was clearly an extremely unbearable feeling for Yuji. It made her feel an indescribable pressure at all times, as if there were countless mountains pressing down on her heart. Now that he had suddenly put it down, the relaxed feeling was naturally especially strong. That's not all. Now, we've actually benefited from this disaster. We've obtained some born Taoism aptitude that could be used immediately. We don't need to cultivate them before we can enter the civilized country like before, Qing Yi said with a smile. Originally, even if it was the born Taoism aptitude they had created, it was absolutely impossible for them to directly enter the civilized country to compete with the original protagonists. If that was the case, how would it be different from what Gui Shou had done? Only after careful cultivation could these creatures be completely integrated into the civilized country's protagonists. Then, they could be thrown into the civilized country to strengthen its strength and resist the attacks of the creatures created by Gui Shou. Although this cultivation process was not very difficult, it was extremely troublesome and required a considerable amount of time. Previously, Qing Yi and Yuji were even prepared to spend thousands or tens of thousands of years to achieve this. But now, because of this unforeseen event, these born creatures were already a part of the civilized country's protagonists. They did not need to be cultivated at all to be able to completely integrate into the civilized country and not cause any wars. This, however, avoided the cultivation process of thousands or tens of thousands of years. This was obviously a good thing. Hearing Qing Yi's words, Yuji nodded, and the joy on his face became even more intense. After watching for a while, They looked at each other and directly strengthened the connection between this world and the outside world, so that the creatures in this world could easily leave this world and appear in the outside world. At this moment, all the creatures in this world had an inexplicable feeling at the same time. They knew that as long as they met a certain requirement, they would be able to ascend to a higher, grander, and vaster world. For a moment, everyone was elated, and the entire world was enveloped in an inexplicable excitement. Seeing all this, Qing, Yi, and Yuji knew that everything was settled. They both smiled and lifted their feet lightly, stepping out of this world and directly appearing on the mountain peak in the palace where Luo Fan was. After they left, figures walked out of that world one by one and appeared at the foot of the mountain, somewhere in the civilized country. They were creatures that had already met the requirements to leave this world, and they directly left that world through that inexplicable connection. However, Qing, Yi, and Yuji no longer care about this. Although their obsession to compete with Gue Shou still existed, it was no longer as strong as before. This was because they had already obtained greater rewards than victory in the process. In other words, in their hearts, they were already the victors. And the victors were usually more forgiving. Gue Shou was also in the palace at this moment, quietly cultivating with his eyes closed in a corner. Noticing their arrival, he opened his eyes and looked at them. For a moment, he could not help but reveal a look of surprise in his eyes. He did not expect that after not seeing each other for so long, Qing, Yi, and Yuji already exuded an aura similar to his. It was clear that they had already achieved natural Taoism aptitude. When Qing, Yi, and Yuji saw Gue Shou, they realized that the previously unfathomable Gue Shou, whose strength they could not detect, seemed to have become a little clearer in their eyes. They seemed to be able to vaguely grasp the boundaries of his strength in an instant. They were even more grateful for their previous choice. Fortunately, they chose to transform their bodies into natural Taoism aptitude. Otherwise, would they not be left behind by Gue Shou? At this moment, in the palace, Luo Fan was already sitting with his eyes closed with a brand new Dharma treasure in his hands. This brand new Dharma treasure looked like a crystal scepter. He held it in his hand. It looked so elegant, but on it, there was an incomparably frightening chill emanating from it. The cold air infected the endless true sage mysteries and great Tao fragments in the palace. This caused the temperature in the palace to be much lower than the outside world. The moment they saw this Dharma treasure, Qing, Yi, and Yuji thought of the creature that could turn into ice back then. In the blink of an eye, they understood that this Dharma treasure was refined by that creature. They guessed right. This Dharma treasure was the one that could turn into ice back then. Moreover, it was said that it was refined by that creature that had an older brother that was tens of thousands of times stronger than it. The time it was refined was not a short period of time when Qing, Yi, and Yuji were constructing their born Taoism aptitude in that world. The phenomenon that was produced at that time was also extremely shocking. It was also extremely eye-catching, enough to attract the attention of any creature. However, because the process of transforming their bodies into natural Taoism aptitude was too painful and uncomfortable, they completely lost their perception of the outside world. That was why they did not feel the various phenomena and did not notice the various shocking movements. In fact, the reason why Gue Shou was still here at this time, instead of cultivating in other places like before, was because Luo Fan was refining the Dharma treasure. He wanted to understand the mysteries of it at a close distance. At this moment, Luo Fan seemed to feel something. He opened his eyes and broke away from that inexplicable state. He looked at Qing, Yi, and Yuji in front of him. In an instant, his pupils shrank slightly. I have actually established a weak connection with that inexplicable place. How is this possible? The moment he saw Qing, Yi, and Yuji, he could already see that the two of them had already established a subtle connection with that inexplicable place that he was immersed in just now. Although this connection was not as close as the connection between the creatures born with intelligence in this world and that inexplicable place, to the point where it could even guide its power to descend, it was already a real existence. With this real connection, Qing Yi and Yu Ji could, at the very least, feel that indescribable existence at all times. If they used some special methods, they could even use that inexplicable place to display some unimaginably powerful means. Although guiding the power of that inexplicable place to descend was the most direct and powerful method of using it, it did not mean that it could only be used in this way. It was just like how, for mortals, the sun could only be used to heat up and dry water. But for cultivators, they could absorb the great sun essence that existed within it. From there, the essence of life could be improved, sublimated, and transformed. Obviously, that inexplicable place was equivalent to the sun at this moment. If they did not know the method, they could only watch its existence helplessly. However, if they knew the method, they could use it to obtain unimaginable power. Thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Not long after, he already knew why the two of them had undergone such a change, and why they had obtained the ability to establish a subtle connection with that inexplicable place at this moment. So it's the innate Taoism aptitude. Come to think of it, after the creatures born with this world obtain the innate Taoism aptitude, their connection with this world will become even closer, and from there, they will reach the point where they can establish a connection with that inexplicable place. He sighed to himself. At this moment, Qing Yi and Yu Ji had already noticed that Luo Fan had woken up. They hurriedly prostrated themselves and asked Luo Fan for guidance. When Luo Fan heard this, he did not keep them in suspense and said directly, "The place that you sensed is an extremely vast and powerful place. If you can truly enter it, you will obtain the abilities of other creatures born with intelligence." The abilities of creatures born with intelligence. Both Qing Yi and Yu Ji were bewildered and confused. However, they were not weak after all, so they quickly recalled what kind of ability it was. The ability to transform into a giant body appeared in their minds at the same time. The ability to transform into a cage. The ability to turn everything around into ice. The ability to turn everything around into magma. The ability to turn them into golden blades for a moment. The two of them were excited. These various abilities. They had already seen many of them before. Moreover, they had always been extremely envious, imagining when they would be able to obtain the same ability. However, because they had too little knowledge, they did not know what kind of ability it was, and they could not understand the source of that ability. At this moment, when they heard Luo Fan say that they were actually so close to that ability, how could they remain calm? "Master, please teach us the way to truly step into that place." Qing Yi and Yu Ji both prostrated themselves at the same time and pleaded. Originally, Guisho did not care about what Qing Yi and Yu Ji wanted to say to Luo Fan. However, at this moment, when he heard Luo Fan talk about the abilities of creatures born with intelligence, how could he remain calm? He immediately pricked up his ears and listened very carefully to every word that Luo Fan said. Although creatures born with intelligence like them could originally guide that inexplicable power down, they had always only known how it was but did not know why it was. As for where this power came from, why this power was so powerful, and why it was so unbelievable, they were all confused. It was also because of this that they could not improve this ability and could not cultivate it. Now that he heard Luo Fan talk about the source of this ability, how could he not be concerned? "This I can't do it." Luo Fan sighed. He was not stingy to admit the limitations of his ability. The more powerful a person was, the more they would not be stingy to admit that they could not do anything. This was not because they had become magnanimous, nor was it because they had become so magnanimous. Instead, the more powerful a person was, the less impact they would have on something that they could not do. For example, to mortals, not knowing how to walk was a flaw that would cut off most of their future. Mortals were naturally unwilling to accept such a flaw, nor were they willing to admit it. However, to powerful cultivators, not only did not know how to walk, even if they did not know how to eat, what impact would have on them. If they could not walk, they would not walk. They would fly. If they could not eat, it was even simpler. They could just absorb vitality from the outside world to replenish their body's needs. What was there to be afraid to admit? Qing Yi and Yu Ji were dumbfounded when they heard what Luo Fan said. Luo Fan was not stingy to admit that he could not do something. This was not a big deal to him. However, to Qing Yi and Yu Ji, who had always thought that Luo Fan was omnipotent, it was a huge blow. For a moment, the two of them were at a loss and felt a little desperate. Their helplessness and despair were partly because they felt that their master's power was not as omnipotent as they had imagined, but it was more because of the despair in their hearts. If even their master could not let them enter that mysterious place, did it mean that they would never have any hope of entering it? Qing Yi and Yu Ji were so shocked, but Gue Shou did not think so at all. Compared to Qing Yi and Yu Ji, although Gue Shou felt that Luo Fan was extremely powerful and could easily kill him, he never thought that he was omnipotent. Especially at this time, their target was the source of their innate ability, which had been researched by countless living beings for countless years without any results. It was normal for Luo Fan to have something that he could not do. At this moment, Gue Shou wanted to know what Luo Fan was going to say next. Luo Fan did not let him wait for long. Soon, he said, "That kind of existence, even I can only enter it with magic treasures. Even I can only rely on magic treasures to enter. How can I let you enter? However, although I can't let you enter it, there are ways for you to gain benefits from it." Hearing this, Qing Yi and Yu Ji were shocked. They broke away from their helplessness, and an inexplicable hope flashed in their eyes. "Master, please give us some pointers." Luo Fan smiled slightly, and countless information flashed in his eyes. In the blink of an eye, through his own understanding of that inexplicable place. According to Qing Yi and Yu Ji's situation at this moment, he created a method that could let them borrow the power of that mysterious place. This kind of dermic formulation, when explained, was actually not too complicated. What it borrowed was just resonance. There was no contact. How to transfer power. Many methods have been revealed in secular scientific research. Among them, the simplest, the easiest to achieve was vibration. And vibration was the most effective way to transfer power. Obviously, it was resonance. At this moment, Qing Yi and Yu Ji could not enter that mysterious place. Obviously, it was the same as how they could not get out of that mysterious place. Under such circumstances, if they wanted to borrow the power of that mysterious place, the best way was, of course, to make themselves resonate with that mysterious place. The method was, of course, to make oneself resonate with that mysterious place. Of course, the principle was that simple, but to achieve it was not an easy thing. It required the user's body and mind, as well as everything else, to undergo extremely subtle and crucial adjustments to be able to achieve it. And this was the key to this divine ability, or rather, this spell. At this moment, the complexity of the spell that Luo Fan created was indescribable. If it was transformed into characters the size of ants and recorded on a few hundred pages of notebooks, the number of notebooks would probably be enough to fill up an area of a few thousand miles. Only a powerful existence like Luo Fan could create such a method so easily. After creating this technique, Luo Fan's heart moved and he raised his hand. In an instant, the technique materialized, guarding the long river of countless words. It pierced through the void and shot into the space between Qing Yi and Yu Ji's eyebrows, directly merging into their memories. This long river of characters continued for a long time, but it took a full 15 minutes before it was barely transmitted into their memories. At this moment, there were already countless characters flickering in Qing Yi and Yu Ji's eyes. Both of them were trembling slightly at this moment. Even the void around them seemed to have countless words hovering around them. Judging from this, it was obvious that the two of them could not completely absorb the information contained in these characters in a short time. At this moment, they were frantically trying to complete this process. At this moment, Gue Shou leaped up and came before Luo Fan. "Master, don't be biased. I want this method too." Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned. "This method is useless to you." Gue Shou chuckled. It's good that it's useless as a reference. I'm actually very interested in that kind of inexplicable place. Hearing this, Luo Fan shook his head and sighed. He was not stingy with the method. Since Guisho wanted it, he would give it to him. Therefore, he did not hesitate. With a thought, a ball of light appeared in his hand. The moment he saw this ball of light, Guisho could not help but raise his eyebrows. How is this an ordinary ball of light? It was clearly the product of countless densely packed characters of light condensed together. Although the densely packed characters were extremely small, he could tell at a glance that they were clearly the long river of characters that he had spent 15 minutes to completely pour into Qing, Yi, and Yuji's memories. Just when he saw what this ball of light was, Luo Fan had already taken action. With a shake of his hand, this ball of light instantly flew out. In the blink of an eye, it had directly penetrated the void and forcibly rushed into the space between Guisho's eyebrows. Compressing the information that would normally take a quarter of an hour to pour into a ball and pushing it in an instant, that feeling was more than a bomb exploding in one's mind. It was like an atomic bomb directly detonating in his heart. Chapter 1573. When Guisho said that Luo Fan was biased, he was, of course, referring to the gentle method he used when he imparted the method to Qing, Yi, and Yuji. He transformed the method into a river of words so that they could easily receive it. But now to him, it was so rough. Even though Qing, Yi, and Yuji had slowly taught him the techniques that he had painstakingly accepted, they were simply two extremes. How could he not feel indignant? Faced with this, Luo Fan only said indifferently, "Your endurance is much stronger than theirs." Guisho naturally could not hear this at all. At this time, he was already immersed in the countless words, trying hard to organize the countless information. After a few days, when Qing, Yi, and Yuji came back to their senses from a method, Guisho was still covered by the countless characters. He still had not finished sorting out the unpredictable method. Why is he doing this? Yuji said with some surprise. He must be insatiable. He wants Master to impart our method to him. Now, he has indigestion. Qing Yi instantly guessed the answer. Then he deserves it. Yuji suddenly understood. At this time, Luo Fan broke away from the state of being immersed in the inexplicable place to perfect his view of the world. He looked at the two of them and said, "Have you completely grasped that method?" Hearing Luo Fan's words, Qing Yi and Yuji both nodded happily. Qing Yi said, "This method is completely compatible with our situation. I feel that as long as I use this method, I will soon be able to obtain some incredible power from that inexplicable place." Yuji could not help nodding. He agreed with Qing Yi's words. Luo Fan nodded and said, "Try it. Let me see the effect of this method." Although this method that resonated with that inexplicable place was created by him, he was very clear about the effect and power of this method when it was used. However, that was only in theory. How powerful would this technique be when it was truly put to use? Without seeing it with his own eyes, he couldn't be completely sure. Qing Yi and Yuji naturally did not dare to refuse Luo Fan's request. Naturally, he agreed without any hesitation. Seeing them like this, Luo Fan's heart stirred. With a wave of his hand, he, Qing Yi, and Yuji left the boundaries of the civilized country in an instant. They appeared in a wasteland tens of thousands of kilometers away from the civilized country. The wasteland was extremely vast. In it, there were only sparse plants. Apart from that, one could faintly hear the sounds of insects. However, it was the best place to test out cultivation techniques. Qing Yi and Yuji were naturally not surprised that Luo Fan had brought them here so easily. Without any hesitation, he slowly closed his eyes, his mind gradually immersed in a strange state, everything about the two of them. In that instant, an extremely subtle and inconceivable change began to take place. This change caused their bodies to gradually have characteristics that they did not have before. In that instant, Luo Fan could already feel that the connection between the two of them and the inexplicable place that was similar to the origin of the realm had become closer and closer. Vaguely, they were touching that inexplicable place in an extremely special way. that special way. It was resonance. Following that, an extremely powerful force descended from nothingness. This was not the kind of incredible power that was directly guided from that inexplicable place. It did not have the mysterious characteristics of that power. However, this power was enough to crush all true, divine, remarkable powers. At the very least, it was enough to crush the true, divine, remarkable powers cast by a fake saint. This kind of power continued to strengthen as the two of them carried out the extremely complicated and subtle adjustments to their bodies. Gradually, it began to change the surrounding space-time and began to affect the endless true divine mysteries and great Tao fragments around them. An effect similar to that inexplicable power began to appear gradually. Both of their bodies had changed along with it. Qin Yi's body suddenly turned into a bolt of lightning. It was an invisible substance that was completely transformed from the true mysteries. As for Yu Ji, he turned into a ray of light. It was a silver ray of light that emitted moonlight. With such a change, their bodies suddenly collapsed. In a trance, the surrounding space-time within an unknown radius of tens of thousands of miles was shrouded in these two rays of light. The originally scattered, true divine mysteries that existed in this area began to be gathered by the lightning and light. It was like a myriad of stars surrounding the moon and began to gather around the two existences. With the help of the countless true divine mysteries, the light and thunderbolts had some kind of indescribable power. They twisted and spiraled in the space-time, changing into all kinds of strange shapes. Some were in the shape of humans, some were in the shape of tigers, leopards, jackals, and wolves, and some were in the shape of other living creatures that they had created. They could really do whatever they wanted. Master, I feel that I have become very powerful now. At this moment, Yu Ji's voice came from the unpredictable light. That's right, Master. I feel that I can easily kill tens of thousands of me from the past. Qin Yi's slightly excited voice also came from the lightning. Hearing their words, Luo Fan smiled and said, "Then let me have a look. Come on, attack me." If it was an ordinary living creature, they would definitely hesitate after hearing this. However, Qin Yi and Yu Ji would not. Although Luo Fan had previously admitted that there were things that he could not do, in their hearts, Luo Fan was still in existence that was close to omnipotent. Since Luo Fan had said to attack him at this moment, they naturally did not hesitate to attack him. Immediately, the light and lightning instantly condensed into the original appearance of Qin Yi and Yu Ji. Immediately after, the two of them moved at the same time, and their bodies quickly charged towards Luo Fan. The momentum of this charge was as if they were charging towards their enemies who had killed their parents. It directly caused the space-time to become chaotic, causing layers of space-time ripples to appear around the lightning and light. At this moment, both of their faces were filled with anticipation and excitement. The lightning formed by Qin Yi became increasingly bright and condensed. The light became even more dazzling, and there seemed to be a faint layer within it. It was as if there was a faintly stronger layer within the light. It was as if there was a more terrifying layer of light. Facing such a merciless attack from the two of them, Luo Fan instantly felt an inexplicable pressure in his heart. The combined power of the two of them is not much weaker than the power guided by ordinary living creatures with natural intelligence. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Between these thoughts, he gently raised his hand, and a large portion of the mystery of true divine and great path fragments that were originally controlled by Qin Yi and Yu Ji instantly broke free from their control and were directly brought into Luo Fan's control. Immediately after, the mystery of true divine and great path fragments turned into ice and vaguely formed a thick barrier in front of Qin Yi and Yu Ji, directly blocking them. Rumble, an earth-shattering loud sound rang out, and the two of them directly collided with the ice barrier. The impact that was produced in that instant spread out and directly caused the surrounding space-time to become like a piece of paper and began to distort crazily. Crazily shaking, Such a collision did not cause any damage to the ice barrier that Luo Fan had condensed at all. There were no cracks on the ice barrier at all, and it did not break. On the contrary, at this moment, it even began to continuously spread towards the light and lightning, gradually turning them into ice. The lightning and light had already suffered great damage from the previous collision, causing the lightning and light to be covered with dense cracks. It looked as if they were constructed by the combination of countless fragments. At this moment, they were once again attacked by the incomparably powerful ice. How could they withstand it? For a moment, the two of them let out a muffled groan. Their bodies quickly retreated, and the inexplicable resonance with the place began to become more and more intense. Along with this resonance, the power that they could guide from the inexplicable place also became stronger and stronger. At this moment, the lightning on their bodies and the radiance on their bodies seemed to have been greatly replenished, and the cracks that covered their bodies were quickly eliminated. Moreover, compared to before, the lightning and light seemed to be clearer and purer. The two of them had only just grasped that technique. At this moment, they could only rely on their unimaginably powerful abilities to display it. Obviously, the potential of that technique could not be fully unleashed. Fighting under such circumstances, every collision, every setback brought about by the opponent was a great training for them. It was enough to let them feel the flaws in the techniques that they had displayed and feel the areas that they lacked in their mastery of the technique. To them, this was obviously an extremely powerful form of training. It was enough to allow them to greatly improve their grasp of this technique. While they were in the process of recovering, Luo Fan did not move at all. Even the ice that he had condensed previously had disappeared without a trace at this moment. He was still facing the two of them, as if he did not have his guard up. What Luo Fan wanted to do was to see how far he could go with that technique, and not to defeat Qing, Yi, and Yuji. With such a goal in mind, there was naturally no need for him to take advantage of the situation to attack. Instead, he just stood there and waited for the two of them to display their skills, waiting for them to unleash a stronger effect of that technique. Qing, Yi, and Yuji came back to their senses and saw that Luo Fan was still standing there quietly, without saying anything to stop. Naturally, they did not stand on ceremony and continued to charge towards Luo Fan. However, this time, they did not just use the original method of charging. Instead, they began to change in midair, and countless shadows of lightning and light appeared. Faintly, they seemed to have condensed into a strange formation. They charged towards Luo Fan with the endless mysteries of the true divine path and fragments of the great path. Looking at his appearance, he simply wanted to tear Luo Fan into pieces. Luo Fan looked at their methods and smiled. With a flick of his finger, an ice giant crawled out from the void. It clenched its fists and punched towards Yuji and Qing Xiao. This explosion was almost like the laws of the world itself, the attributes of the world itself, making all living beings feel as if they couldn't resist it. There was no way to escape, and he could only forcefully block it. Any living creature. This naturally included Qing, Yi, and Yuji. At this moment, the two of them felt that no matter how they dodged or how they changed, they would not be able to escape the two fists of the frost giant. Helplessly, they could only change directions and launch their attacks at the ice giant, colliding with the ice giant's fist. At this moment, an earth-shattering roar erupted from the point of collision and began to sweep in all directions. It even stirred up the void, causing the surrounding mysteries of the true divine path and fragments of the great path to scatter in all directions. It began to reveal an empty area that had no mysteries of the true divine path. That frost giant wasn't just powerful. Its techniques were mysterious, but its power to turn everything into ice was equally terrifying. Even though it was just a mere contact, Qing, Yi, and Yuji were resisting the terrifying impact. They also felt that their attacks were gradually turning into ice. Regardless of whether it was the light or the lightning, they were all the same, almost the same change as before appeared. Countless cracks appeared on the bodies of the two of them. Moreover, they could feel a strong chill seeping out from the cracks. It looked as if the countless fragments were wrapping around a shocking piece of ice, being sent flying by such a terrifying force. Qing, Yi, and Yuji had no choice but to reveal their figures again. At the same time, their bodies could not help but tremble slightly. They could not bear the chill that seemed to penetrate into their life essence, and wanted to turn their life essence into ice. In this pain, the two of them could only continue to dig out the potential of the technique and continue to work hard to guide the power from that unknown place. It took a while for them to fully recover. When they recovered, they found that the ice giant had actually arrived in front of them, and two fists were thrown at them again. Boom, 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 boom. In the following time, countless tremors began to ring out from this location. Amidst the tremors, the space and time in this area seemed to have become ripples. It was casually lifted, casually destroyed, and then quickly stirred and distorted. Just from this point alone, one could imagine how intense and shocking the battle was. This forging battle lasted for a few days. After a few days, when Qing, Yi, and Yuji were barely able to fight the ice giant to a standstill, and the process of the battle became more balanced, instead of a one-sided suppression, Luo Fan already knew that the potential of the technique should have been completely unearthed. With a thought, the ice giant instantly collapsed and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. Since the potential of the technique had been dug out, it clearly meant that Qing, Yi, and Yuji no longer needed to do anything. Naturally, he could not be bothered to force them. Qing, Yi, and Yuji, who had been fighting the ice giant with great difficulty, were doing their best to dodge the ice giant's attacks. When they suddenly realized that the ice giant had disappeared, they could not react for a moment. Their eyes were filled with confusion. After a long while, they finally recovered and let out a long sigh of relief. Although it had only been a few short days, these few days felt like countless years to them. During this period of time, they felt as if their bodies and minds had been completely crushed countless times and then reconnected again. That kind of feeling could almost be said to be unable to live or die. After all the potential of the technique is stimulated, it can roughly allow them to display the power of a creature with innate intelligence. Not bad, Luo Fan thought to himself. Through the pressure from before, he had already completely understood the effect of the technique. Although the essence of the technique was weaker than the power that was guided from that unknown place. But by continuously digging out its potential, it could continuously close the gap and finally reach a point where it was almost infinitely close. This kind of power, coupled with the use of some special techniques and the display of power that surpassed other creatures with innate intelligence, the power was comparable to the power that could only display the basic power. However, this was already the limit. After all, the difference in essence was difficult to overcome. If those creatures with innate intelligence could use the power slightly better than the basic power, like the current Gui show, in that case, this technique would be useless. After making up his mind, Luo Fan said, "I understand. Let's go back." As he spoke, he casually waved his hand. In an instant, the three of them directly broke the void, and in the blink of an eye, they had already returned to the palace that Luo Fan had been staying in. At this time, the densely packed characters around Gui Shou's body had already disappeared. However, he was still sitting there with his legs crossed, and his expression was still fluctuating. Obviously, after these few days, although he had roughly sorted out the information so that the characters did not overflow his body, because there were too many characters, at this time, he had not completely sorted them out and had not yet completely grasped that technique. You have just grasped all the potential of this technique and still need a process of stabilizing it. Go down. Without waiting for Qing, Yi, and Yuji to say anything, Luo Fan waved his hand and sent them out. Qing, Yi, and Yuji both stood outside the palace, looking a little confused. Yuji said, "Why is Master in such a hurry? We haven't even said a word. We don't need to care about Master's matters." Qing, he shook his head and said, "It's better for us to cultivate honestly. The improvement in the past few days was really too fast. If there is no process of stabilizing it, I'm afraid that it will affect the display of our strength." As he spoke, Qing Yi's face faintly showed a joyful expression. Fast improvement was originally something worth being happy about. Even if this kind of rapid improvement seemed to have an unstable foundation and needed a long time to consolidate it, it was still the same. Hearing Qing Yi's words, Yuji quickly threw all kinds of thoughts aside and said, "That's right." As he spoke, the two of them each entered a world that they had opened up. Of course, because of the previous lesson, the world they entered this time was a world with extremely few living beings. Back then, although the worlds that Qing Yi and Yuji opened up were full of vitality, there were always some worlds that would become barren and uninhabited because of the living beings who sought death. After sending Qing Yi and Yuji away, Luo Fan stared at the Guei show in front of him. There were unknown words and countless runes flashing in his eyes. Through the battle with Yuji and Qing Yi previously, an inexplicable inspiration appeared in Luo Fan's heart. At this moment, he was going to turn this inspiration into reality. It was also because of this inspiration that he was so anxious to send Qing Yi and Yuji away. He did not wait for them to say a word and waste his time. It was rather difficult to turn this inspiration into reality. In other words, it would take a lot of time and energy to turn this inspiration into reality. While Luo Fan was thinking about turning this inspiration into reality, the Guei show was trying hard to sort out the specific cultivation method of the technique that Luo Fan had forced into it. The hall fell into a moment of silence. Even the sound of breathing could not be heard. Time flew by, and in the blink of an eye, half a month had passed. After half a month, the Guei show was the first to change. The Guei show's body trembled slightly, and the various expressions on his face instantly calmed down. His eyes even slowly opened. In his eyes, there was enlightenment, doubt, and confusion. At the same time, such a thought flashed in his mind. There's actually such a technique. Master is really omnipotent. At this moment, he had already sorted out the countless words and completely sorted out the technique. He had even carefully studied it several times, and he had a clear understanding of the basic principles of this technique. However, the more he understood, the more he felt that this technique was broad and profound, and the more he felt how profound the principles contained in this technique were. Chapter 1574. This technique was completely created for living beings that could not be touched, but could sense the inexplicable presence. $top, $dollar novel, though, it was able to use an extremely ingenious method to guide the mysterious energy down. The energy that was guided down was a notch weaker than the energy that it was able to directly guide down from within itself. Moreover, the consumption was even greater. In comparison, it was obviously an impractical technique, and it did not have much meaning to him. While Guei Shou was feeling regretful, Luo Fan had already found a way to turn his previous burst of inspiration into reality. His heart stirred. He raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. He easily caught Guei Shou, who had just woken up. Guei Shou was taken aback and instinctively cried out, "Master, please spare my life." Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and he said, "Who wants your life? I just want you to try to guide the inexplicable power down now." Hearing this, Guei Shou heaved a sigh of relief. Then, with a thought, he said, If Master creates a technique, can you teach it to me again?" Luo Fan glanced at him and knew that he must have tasted the sweetness of the technique that he had forcefully stuffed into his memory. Therefore, he did not waste any time and said calmly, "As long as you want to, it's naturally not a problem. Stop talking nonsense and quickly guide the power." Here, Guei Shou asked curiously. Although this palace looked extremely special because of Luo Fan, it was just an ordinary palace. If he were to display the power that could destroy a false saint here, this palace would probably be completely destroyed in an instant. Hearing his words, Luo Fan said calmly, "Go ahead. I have my own plans." Since he had already said that, Guei Shou naturally had nothing else to say and nodded. Then, he activated a kind of talent that he had since he was born and slowly guided the inexplicable power that was hidden somewhere. In an instant, a completely empty cage appeared in front of him. it began to turn everything around it into nothingness, including the true Saint Mystery, including the fragment of the great Tao and everything in this palace. There was even a faint sign that it was going to turn Luo Fan into nothingness. Using this ability, before guiding the power down, Gui Shou was still hesitant. But at this moment, however, he had already poured all of his attention into the technique he was executing. There was no other reason. After comprehending the technique that Luo Fan had passed on to him, he realized that his understanding of that power and his control over it had increased. It was already much stronger than before. At this moment, he had already felt that the various details of this power had become so clear in his mind. Moreover, the manipulation that he couldn't do in the past had also become so natural at this moment. With a slight thought, the cage that he couldn't control its shape at all had changed. In the blink of an eye, it turned from a sphere to a cube. Then it turned into a cube, 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 a cube. In the end, the cage directly turned into a human figure. Standing there, it looked like a human body that was completely made of nothingness. After the cage turned into a human figure, Gui Shou felt that his mind had completely integrated with the cage in a trance. It was as if the cage itself had become his body. It turns out that this technique can be used here. At this moment, an indescribable joy flashed in Gui Shou's heart. At this moment, he had already found the method to use the technique that Luo Fan had forced into his memory that he thought he couldn't use at all. The essence of this technique was resonance. And resonance could be directly with that unknown place, but it could also be with the power that was guided from that unknown place. For him, it was not necessary to directly resonate with that unknown place because he could directly enter that unknown place and guide that kind of power directly. Resonating with something was like taking off one's pants to fart. However, resonating with the power that he guided was completely different. It was not only because the difficulty of resonating with the power that he guided was countless times lower than resonating with that unknown place. It could be completed almost effortlessly. Moreover, after resonating, the power was not guided down, but on the contrary, one could completely connect one's will and one's mind with that power. This seemed very mysterious, but in fact, it was just like what Gui Shou was doing at this moment. It could completely transform the thing that the power transformed into a form that was similar to his own body. Thus, the use of that power would be improved by leaps and bounds. Could it be that Master wants to remind me of this? At this moment, such a thought suddenly flashed in Gui Shou's mind, and he couldn't help but feel inexplicably grateful to Luo Fan. As the cage turned into an existence that was similar to his body, the uncontrollable trend of expanding the cage naturally stopped. All the power was completely restrained, and the damage to the palace completely disappeared. Moreover, under Gui Shou's mind, the figure in the cage gradually shrank and became smaller. In a short while, it had been compressed to the size of an ordinary person. It seemed that except for the essence of nothingness, everything else was already no different from a normal creature with a born Taoism aptitude. Seeing his performance, Luo Fan's eyes showed a flash of understanding. He stopped the suppression of Gui Shou's power that he had originally prepared. Of course, at this time, he let Gui Shou guide the inexplicable power down, not specifically to let Gui Shou master the changes of his power at this time. Therefore, it was naturally impossible for him to foresee that this power would not cause much damage to the palace. He can actually think of such a way to use that technique. It seems that his wisdom has really improved a lot. At this time, such a thought flashed in his mind. Luo Fan naturally knew why Gui Shou's power in actual combat would have such a change at a glance, and he had no doubts at all. Thinking of this, he let go of Gui Shou and said, "You can take back that power." Hearing this, Gui Shou became more and more convinced that Luo Fan wanted him to master this method of combining this technique and power, and he felt more and more grateful to Luo Fan. Nodding his head, he replied and slowly dispersed the aura. After dispersing the power, he found that his consumption was much smaller than before. That was to say, he wanted to guide this power again, and he wanted to use this unimaginably powerful method again. He didn't need to wait as long as before. Instead, he only needed to wait for a very short period of time. He thought of something. After a while, he figured out the reason. Because he had a deeper control of this power. In the process of guiding this power, every moment was consumed, but it was smaller than before. In this way, the overall consumption was naturally smaller. Luo Fan didn't have much time to waste on him. He waved his hand and let him leave. After Gue Shou left, countless runes, words, true divine mysteries, and great path fragments began to shine on his body. In the process of these mysterious existences shining, the space-time of the entire palace, the entire mountain, and even the entire civilized country were slightly shaking. Above the void, there were inexplicable clouds that were rapidly accumulating and gradually turned into a layer of extremely thick and dense tribulation clouds. The tribulation clouds covered a very wide area, directly covering tens of thousands of miles of the entire civilized country. Such tribulation clouds were not inferior to the tribulation of Gue Shou's transformation. It felt as if there was a tribulation more powerful than the transformation tribulation brewing, waiting to erupt. At this moment, Luo Fan felt an indescribably strong pressure acting on him. Under this pressure, he felt that everything inside and outside of his body seemed to be unable to bear the heavy burden. He faintly felt that he was about to collapse and be destroyed. However, Luo Fan didn't have the slightest intention of stopping. The words, lines, runes, true divine mysteries, great path fragments, and everything else that surged out of his body continued to surge out. Moreover, they were surging out at a faster speed and denser than before. Among these countless mysterious existences, Luo Fan's body slowly disintegrated. Countless fine dust particles began to slowly float out from his body. They slowly rose up and gradually piled up on top of his head, surging up. As this piling up and surging, something that Luo Fan was extremely familiar with slowly appeared. It was a three-legged round cauldron. This three-legged round cauldron actually had a name: the Heavenly Divine Court Cauldron. This process continued. After an unknown period of time, Luo Fan's entire body had completely turned into nothingness, and the three-legged round cauldron above his head had completely solidified and turned into a solid entity. An aura of a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure began to slowly emit from it. If this aura was in any other world, it would definitely be earth-shattering. Perhaps just this aura alone was enough to destroy the world. But at this moment, in this world, this aura was only ordinary. Although all living beings within a radius of tens of thousands of miles could feel its existence, compared to the entire world, it was so insignificant that it wasn't even worth mentioning. At this moment, a bolt of lightning finally fell from the tribulation clouds in the sky, directly towards the palace. It directly smashed towards the Heavenly Divine Court Cauldron in the palace. The Heavenly Divine Court Cauldron, which had already solidified again, directly rushed into the void, directly breaking through the obstruction of the palace, directly rushing into the void above the palace, and arrived at a position extremely close to the tribulation clouds. The tribulation clouds seemed to have sensed its provocation, and at this moment, they became even more frantic. Endless lightning, flames, and everything else could be imagined. Unimaginable. All kinds of strange attacks began to strike the Heavenly Divine Court Cauldron without any regard for their lives. Facing this endless attack, the suppressive power of the Heavenly Divine Court Cauldron began to surge continuously, trying its best to resist these attacks. Unfortunately, each of the attacks launched by the tribulation clouds was formed from the profound mysteries of the true sage, and each of them contained terrifying power that could destroy a false sage. Although the power of the Heavenly Divine Court Cauldron was powerful, the attacks it used were only ordinary false sage attacks, after all. Facing this kind of attack, it was powerless. The suppressive power was broken layer by layer. The attacks of the tribulation clouds began to affect it one after another. Under this bombardment, the heavenly divine court cauldron collapsed in the short span of a breath, turning into countless tiny fragments again. However, for the heavenly divine court cauldron, which was originally formed from the condensation of countless fragments. However, this was not a fatal injury. At this moment, the fragments formed by the heavenly divine court cauldron formed a vortex in the void, frantically devouring the attacks of the tribulation clouds, as well as the endless true sage mysteries and fragments of the great Tao. Faintly, it resonated with that inexplicable place, faintly guiding that inexplicable place's power down, forming an indescribable fusion power. It constantly fused everything that was absorbed into it with itself. Compared to Qing, Yi, and Yuji, the resonance between the heavenly divine court cauldron and that inexplicable place was more free. It had even reached the point where it could freely guide the power down from it. The tribulation clouds and the void continued to pour down countless attacks, bombarding the vortex formed by the fragments of the heavenly divine court cauldron. In this way, the vortex that was replenished with power began to grow bigger and bigger. As time passed, it gradually became a cloud under the tribulation clouds. The other was an even stranger and more mysterious cloud. During this entire process, the space within a radius of who knows how many tens of thousands of kilometers seemed to have been thrown into a jar and was constantly shaking. It began to shake violently all the time. Any living being could clearly see the two layers of clouds in the void, as well as the endless attacks between the two layers of clouds. Under such a change, how could Qing, Yi, and Yuji continue to cultivate in the barren world like they were before? They left that world as fast as they could and arrived outside the palace where Luo Fan was. They saw Gue Shou, who was also there. "What's wrong? Why can't we enter the palace? Did something happen to my master?" Yuji directly asked Gue Shou. The two of them wanted to enter the palace directly, but for some reason, the space-time in the palace seemed to be completely isolated from the outside world. They couldn't enter no matter what method they used, so they had no choice but to appear outside the palace. Gue Shou didn't mind Yuji's rude question. At this moment, there was a trace of worry in his eyes. "I don't know either. Just now, after Master asked me to leave, there was a phenomenon. Then, everything that you're seeing happened. You don't know either? Then what's the use of you?" Yuji said furiously. "All right, stop arguing. Master is so powerful. How could anything happen to him? You're thinking too much." Qing Yi frowned. Hearing this, Yuji and Gue Shou looked at each other. Although they hadn't completely gotten over it yet, they were slightly more relaxed than before. At this moment, they recalled Luo Fan's almost omnipotent means. Being so powerful, he must have been confident in everything he did. Rather than suspecting that something would happen to him, it was more likely that something would happen to themselves. The attacks from the tribulation clouds in the sky seemed to be never-ending. They were relentless and relentless, bombarding crazily. As time passed, this space-time was gradually changed by the power of the tribulation cloud. Unknowingly, it had gradually become independent from the outside world. All kinds of inexplicable rules began to appear out of thin air. Gradually, magma appeared out of thin air and began to rush up toward the cloud formed by the divine court heavenly cauldron. At the same time, earth fire, killing intent, and all kinds of sinister attacks that couldn't possibly appear in the sky began to appear out of thin air. They rushed up toward the cloud from the bottom. When the attacks from the bottom first appeared, they scattered the cloud's operation slightly. It slightly scattered the movement of the cloud, causing the movement of the cloud to be affected at this moment. It actually appeared to be slightly chaotic. However, the divine hall heavenly cauldron quickly adjusted itself. It also began to devour the power of the countless attacks that had appeared below. More and more attacks continued to merge into it, causing the speed at which the cloud grew even faster. During this process, the heavenly cauldron of the divine court resonated with that indescribable place and gradually transformed. This kind of transformation was something that should have never happened. Resonance. In the midst of the transformation, unknowingly, it had become contact. The power that was guided from that inexplicable place through resonance had unknowingly turned into a power that was countless times stronger than normal. When this transformation was finally completed, the divine court heaven cauldron absorbed an immeasurable amount of energy. Countless true sage, profound mysteries. Countless fragments of the great Tao. The cloud formed by the countless attacks began to stop expanding. Although it was still absorbing everything, it was gradually shrinking in size. That was the attack of the tribulation clouds. The attack that came out of nowhere became stronger and more terrifying as it shrank. However, this space-time became more and more stable during this process. The tremors caused by the attack of the tribulation clouds became weaker and weaker. It felt as though all the aftershocks of the attack had been completely absorbed by the divine court heaven cauldron itself. Right at this moment, within the palace below, a figure slowly materialized from an illusory figure and started to appear. He was the figure of Luo Fan. When Luo Fan first appeared, he seemed extremely weak. He seemed to be only a level 9 pseudo-sage. He wasn't even a pseudo-sage. He felt as though he couldn't withstand the pressure of this space-time. However, as he began to engulf the endless true sage profound mysteries around him and began to devour the endless great Tao fragments around him, his aura began to slowly rise. It began to push the essence of his life to produce an extremely fundamental transformation. It was a transformation from a pseudo-sage to a pseudo-sage. After an unknown period of time, there was a soft sound in the void, and an unimaginable and inexplicable wave directly descended from nowhere. Immediately after, an aura that belonged to a pseudo-sage directly emitted from Luo Fan's body and began to fill the palace. At this moment, Luo Fan had an inexplicable understanding in his heart. I've really succeeded. I've really obtained the innate ability of this world's living beings. With a thought, his mind instinctively entered an inexplicable place that was similar to the origin of the realm. He could clearly and intuitively feel the endless true sage, profound mysteries that existed in that inexplicable place, as well as the almost opposite combination of the true sage, profound mysteries, and the origin of the realm. Compared to the way he entered this inexplicable place in the past, he didn't use anything else this time. He directly entered this place with his own strength. Compared to entering this place with the help of a magic treasure in the past, he felt more intimate with this inexplicable place at this moment. Everything he felt became clearer and clearer. Moreover, there was an inexplicable suction force that was pulling his mind, making him continuously go to the depths of this inexplicable place. This was something that he had never felt before when he entered this place with the help of a magic treasure. With a thought, Luo Fan let his mind go to the depths of this inexplicable place with the help of this suction force without hesitation. After crossing an unknown distance and passing through an unknown number of true sage, profound mysteries, when the suction force completely stopped, Luo Fan felt that he had already arrived at a combination of true sage, profound mysteries. Compared to what he had seen in the past, the combination of true sage, profound mysteries in this inexplicable place was even more profound. Here, any combination of true sage, profound mysteries could almost be regarded as a true sage theurgy in the outside world. Any combination could almost make him feel that his worldview was still very simple. In other words, every combination could almost perfect his worldview. Chapter 1575. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He suddenly had an inexplicable feeling, as though there were countless inexplicable powers around him in this boundless and inexplicable place. Top the novel X. And the existence of these powers made him instantly know that he could choose any of these powers to descend into reality. In his senses, the effects of this kind of power were revealed to him without reservation. Among them, there was the power that could turn the mystery of true sane into ice, the power that could turn everything into magma, and the power that could form another body. There were all kinds of powers that he had seen before. It was as though there were still countless powers around him, but he could only understand and sense the powers that he had seen before. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan had already come to a realization. He knew that the power that he could use now was not the limit. Next, as long as he could see more powers, he would be able to grasp more powers at the same time. After making up his mind, Luo Fan slowly came out of that state, and his mind returned to his body. Immediately after, with a slight thought, he had already guided the mysterious power from that place down. Under this power, his body had already turned into ice that emitted endless cold air in the blink of an eye. Moreover, the ice began to spread in all directions, gradually turning everything in the entire palace into ice, including the mystery of True Saint. This included the Great Tao Fragment, as well as all the other powers. Compared to the living creature that Luo Fan had seen before, which could turn the mystery of True Saint into ice, the current Luo Fan's control over the ice was thousands of times stronger than his. Moreover, the ice that he had used with the power was much colder than the living creature's ice. It had even vaguely frozen everything, causing this area to become space-time. Everything had completely stopped. It must be known, this world was not an ordinary world. If it was an ordinary world, it wouldn't be difficult to freeze the emptiness to a stop. Even a sage-to-be could do it easily. However, in this world where even ordinary living beings had power that was similar to the false sage stage, there was no way that ordinary living beings could survive. He wanted to do this. Even those in despair would find it difficult to do so. Luo Fan could now borrow this power to do this easily. It was enough to show how terrifying his power was. Sensing the power in his hand as if it was his own body, Luo Fan's heart thumped again, and the power that could freeze everything instantly dissipated. Subsequently, another kind of power was guided down by him from that inexplicable place. After dispersing the power that could freeze everything, Luo Fan sensed that the power had entered a cool-down period. If he wanted to guide this power down again, he would have to wait for a long time. It was similar to the restrictions that Gue Shou and the others, who were born with innate intelligence, faced. However, this was to be expected. Perhaps only true sages could have a method that was truly without any restrictions. Luo Fan was very clear about this. Therefore, at this moment, he clearly felt this restriction, but he didn't feel disappointed. At this moment, he had already guided another kind of power down from that unknown place. In an instant, rolling magma replaced the ice from before, directly replacing everything inside the palace, turning the entire palace into a world of magma. Even he himself had turned into magma at this moment. This was impressively the power of the creature that Luo Fan had seen back then, the one that was most hostile to the creature that could use its power to turn everything into ice. Similar to the ice from before, the power that Luo Fan displayed now was more than 100 times stronger than that of the living being back then. The temperature of the magma and the precision of his control were incomparable to that of the living being back then. After roughly testing the effect of this power, Luo Fan dispersed the power once again. As the power dispersed, the surrounding magma that filled the entire palace gradually dissipated. At this moment, the mysteries of true sages, the great Tao fragments, and other energies reappeared. In the blink of an eye, the original world of magma had returned to its original state. As expected, at this moment, he also felt that he still needed a period of time to cool down before he could continue using this power that could turn everything into magma. However, there were no restrictions on the other powers that he could guide, and he could still guide them down at any time. At this moment, the cloud that was formed by the heavenly divine cauldron had already shrunk to its limit, and a three-legged cauldron appeared within the boundless attacks. Furthermore, it began to frantically devour the attacks, turning them into energy that replenished its essence, pushing its essence to rise bit by bit. From the looks of it, it was clear that the heavenly divine cauldron's essence had been raised to a certain level, and it could practically ignore the pressure brought by this bizarre tribulation. Luo Fan raised his eyes, and looked at it. His eyes directly penetrated the barrier of the palace, penetrated the barrier of the heavy attacks from below, and directly saw the changes of the heavenly cauldron of the divine court. He instantly understood this point in his heart, and his expression couldn't help but relax a little. Given the current situation, if the heavenly divine cauldron wanted to be raised to a primal origin spiritual treasure, it would naturally be wishful thinking. The level was naturally delusional, but through the refinement of the tribulation, its essence could be greatly improved, and it could definitely be improved to 10,000 times its original strength. At this stage, the power of the heavenly divine cauldron itself was actually equivalent to that of a person in despair. If the influence of the tribulation was added to the fact that it could directly communicate with that inexplicable place, then its power would increase once again. In the end, it would definitely reach an unimaginable height, and it would become Luo Fan's most powerful force. And this clearly meant that Luo Fan's action of turning his inspiration into reality had truly succeeded. Previously, the inspiration that Luo Fan had received was none other than to truly become a fake saint in this world, so that he could obtain an innate ability similar to that of the creatures born with innate intelligence in this world. In other words, he could obtain the ability to cast his mind into that inexplicable place. The reason why he thought that becoming a real fake saint in this world would give him this ability was very simple. First of all, he already had the same innate Tao constitution as Qing, Yi, and Yuji. This could be seen from Qing, Yi, and Yuji. This innate Tao constitution was an existence that was worthy of being close to in this world. The reason why he did not obtain similar abilities like Qing, Yi, and Yuji was because his innate Tao constitution was condensed in another world and had nothing to do with this world. Secondly, in this world, even ordinary living beings, in terms of level, they were all equivalent to the false saint stage. Therefore, it could be said that, in this world, if a living being that had yet to become a false saint directly became a false saint, it would be as if he was born in this world. And since he was born in this world, he would naturally receive the blessing of this world and naturally possess the innate ability that was connected to that inexplicable place. The combination of these two reasons allowed Luo Fan to come to the conclusion that becoming a false saint in this world would give him this innate ability. For other people in despair, even if they had such inspiration and felt that this possibility was extremely likely to become a reality, they would not be able to implement it. However, Luo Fan was different. Although Luo Fan was a true person in despair in an existence that surpassed the false saint stage, he did not become a false saint back then. He did not really place himself in the great Tao of a certain world when he became a false saint back then. He did not really become a false saint in a certain world. Instead, he relied on himself to completely fuse with his pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure, the heavenly cauldron of the divine court, and treated the heavenly cauldron of the divine court as his body. Although this could not be considered a trick, it gave him the possibility of doing it all over again. It was also because of this that Luo Fan had separated the heavenly cauldron of the divine court previously. The truth was just as he had expected. After the heavenly cauldron of the divine court was separated, his realm began to fall continuously. From the level of a person in despair who could easily destroy a false saint, it fell to the false saint stage, and then from the false saint stage to the level 9 false saint stage. This rate of decline seemed to be covering his soul with a thick layer of dust at almost every moment, causing his originally clear and bright soul to gradually dim. The countless mysteries that he had originally comprehended began to gradually become illusory, and in the end, they completely left him. If it was an ordinary person in despair, this would be a situation where they would be doomed eternally. For ordinary people in despair, if their realm fell, they would really fall. If they wanted to break through in the future, there would be no shortcut at all. It was completely like how a level 9 false saint stage would become a person in despair. It would take endless years and countless unbelievable powers to achieve it. If any of the conditions could not be met, they would forever be a level 9 false saint. However, Luo Fan was clearly not an ordinary person in despair. Compared to other people in despair, he had an extremely huge advantage that was unimaginable to any person in despair. That was the foundation of his cultivation was his worldview of laws. After years of hard work and improvement, his worldview of laws had long been truly raised to the level of a person in despair, reaching a level that was extremely close to the true saint stage. With the support of such a worldview, if he wanted to cultivate to become a person in despair again, it was almost like following a map. As long as he followed the instructions of the worldview, he would naturally be able to break through the various realms and finally become a person in despair. There was no need to look at opportunities or how much time was needed. In particular, in this world with endless mysteries of true saints and great Tao fragments, the difficulty was even more than 10,000 times lower than in other worlds. This was also the fundamental reason why Luo Fan had enough confidence to start implementing this idea after thinking about it for a short period of time. After the tribulation cloud in the sky raged for a few days, it finally dissipated slowly. At this moment, the aura emitted from the heavenly cauldron of divine court. It was already more than 10,000 times stronger than before. Under this aura, all living beings within a radius of tens of thousands of miles felt an indescribably powerful pressure from the bottom of their hearts. Under this pressure, even Gue, Shou, and Qing, he could clearly feel that if the heavenly cauldron of divine court wanted to, it could easily kill all of them. Even if they all had mastered means that exceeded their own strength, it would still be the same. After understanding this, all of them could not help but gasp. I didn't expect Master to be so powerful. The three of them thought in their hearts. Almost at the same time, they sighed with emotion. The heavenly cauldron of divine court was a magic treasure. The three of them, who had seen Luo Fan refine a magic treasure, were naturally quite clear about this. At this moment, they naturally knew that the heavenly cauldron of divine court was a magic treasure refined by Luo Fan. Even the appearance of this tribulation. At this moment, they also had an idea. They believed that this tribulation was deliberately summoned by Luo Fan to refine a magic treasure, and it was a help to refine a magic treasure. As for the worry they had for Luo Fan, it was just a matter of time. Naturally, it had already been thrown somewhere else. As the tribulation clouds dissipated, the isolation from the outside world slowly disappeared, and the connection with the outside world began to gradually reestablish. However, vaguely, there was already an indescribable barrier that had appeared between this place and the outside world. This barrier could not completely cut off the connection between the space-time within this area and the outside world, but it caused an obvious difference in levels between the two. This difference in levels did not mean that the level here was higher, nor did it mean that the level of the outside world was higher. Instead, it was as if a line had been drawn at a certain location, forming two parts. Between them, there was no distinction of who was higher and who was lower. When this barrier completely stabilized and no longer dissipated, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh. It actually formed this kind of barrier. It seems that the number of times I've refined treasures in this area is too many, and the number of times I've separated this place from the outside world is too many. Compared to the other living beings who were confused, Luo Fan already knew the reason why this barrier had appeared. Ever since he arrived at this mountain peak, Luo Fan had been constantly refining treasures and cultivating. Because of his actions, the heaven and earth within a radius of tens of thousands of miles have been separated from the outside world again and again, gaining independence again and again. If this happened once or twice, there would not be much of an impact. The outside world would still be able to easily reconnect this separation, and everything would still be able to return to its original state. However, just like bending a piece of metal, no matter how tough the metal was, it could not withstand repeated bending and resetting. When a number of times reached a certain level, the bending would naturally leave a deep mark on the metal. If the number of times was too high, the metal would directly break. Right now, because the space-time within this area had been separated from the outside world too many times, deep marks had already been left behind unknowingly, and it was difficult to remove them, If that's the case, it looks like other living beings will arrive very soon. Suddenly, such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind, and he could not help but smile faintly. The reason why he came to this conclusion was because of the information he obtained from a living being that could borrow an indescribable power to freeze everything. According to what that living being had said back then, there was a huge organization behind that living being's elder brother. This meant that there would definitely be living beings in that organization that were far more powerful and intelligent than normal living beings in this world. The more powerful and intelligent a living being was, the more they would pay attention to the various abnormalities that happened in their territory. Under such circumstances, a barrier that had never appeared before suddenly appeared in this area. How could this not attract their attention? How could they not come to investigate as soon as possible? As for why Luo Fan smiled after learning about this, the reason was not complicated. Compared to before, his current strength had greatly improved once again. No matter what kind of living beings came, he was confident that he would be able to defeat them. If those living beings came, they would obviously only be delivering him materials for refining treasures. How could he not be happy? As he thought about it, Luo Fan raised his hand and waved gently. The heavenly cauldron of the divine court, which had just passed the tribulation, trembled and directly crossed the space to arrive in front of him. At the same time, the barrier that originally existed in the hall and the outside world instantly disappeared. The connection between the hall and the outside world was re-established. Qing Yi and the others sensed this change at the same time. They hurriedly stepped into the hall and arrived near Luo Fan. The moment they saw Luo Fan clearly, they were all shocked. There was no other reason. At this moment, Luo Fan, although he looked the same as before, his entire aura had undergone a huge change. It was as if he was a completely different person. Moreover, apart from the change in aura, they also felt that the Luo Fan in front of him seemed to be weaker than before. It was as if his strength had been greatly reduced. Could it be? Master is already injured? This thought instantly flashed through the minds of the three of them. In their minds, such strange changes could only occur when one was injured. Luo Fan didn't pay attention to the three of them at all. At this moment, he was fondling the divine court heavenly cauldron in his hand fondly. At this moment, the heavenly cauldron of the divine court seemed to have become an extension of his body, a part of his body. All the power and all the changes were under his control. An indescribable sense of stability was transmitted to his body, causing him to feel that his entire body and mind had become extremely calm and serene. It was as if he would not lose his composure, even if a true saint suddenly appeared in front of him. In a trance, he felt that his strength would increase by at least 10 times with the divine court's heavenly cauldron. Under such circumstances, how could he not be fond of the divine court's heavenly cauldron? After a long while, Luo Fan casually put the divine court's heavenly cauldron into his body. Compared to the situation where he had completely fused with the divine court's heavenly cauldron and turned it into his body, the feeling of putting the divine court's heavenly cauldron into his body now was completely different. In the past, when he turned the divine court's heavenly cauldron into his body, he only felt like he was in his body. Although he could clearly sense its existence, it felt as if it didn't exist at all. He could use all of its power and techniques, all his abilities, all his methods, but he still couldn't see its true appearance clearly. But now, apart from being able to use all of his powers, abilities, and techniques, not only was he able to see his opponent's appearance, he was also able to easily change his appearance. This was something that he had never been able to do before. The moment the divine court's heavenly cauldron entered his body, Gui Shou, Qing Yi, and Yu Ji once again felt that Luo Fan's aura seemed to have changed again. In a trance, he seemed to have returned to the state that they were familiar with. How could there be such a change? For a moment, the three of them were indescribably shocked. At this moment, Luo Fan also looked at the three of them and instantly grasped their thoughts. He could not help but smile and said, "There's no need to think too much about this. However, you all need to be prepared. I'm afraid that there will be enemies coming soon. If you're not careful, this civilized country will be overturned." When Xing Yi and the other two heard Luo Fan's words, their expressions changed slightly. Luo Fan was so powerful that they could not imagine just how powerful an existence that he believed could overturn this civilized country was. How could they still be bothered with the change in Luo Fan's aura? In the end, Gui Shou asked, "May I ask, Master, what kind of powerful enemy will it be?" "You'll know when the time comes. All you need to do is to be prepared." Luo Fan shook his head and smiled. Hearing this, Qing Yi and the others sternly agreed. Then they were about to leave and speed up their original cultivation. At this moment, Luo Fan stopped Gui Shou. Gui Shou was originally the most anxious, but when he was stopped by Luo Fan, he could not help but feel puzzled and asked, "May I know what orders Master has for me?" Hearing this, Luo Fan could not help but laugh and said, "Have you forgotten?" Chapter 1576. Fan, before this, Gui Shou had clearly begged Luo Fan to teach him the method that he had created. However, Luo Fan had encountered a calamity and interrupted his wait, causing him to unknowingly forget about it. It was obvious that Luo Fan had mentioned this at this time to show that he wanted to teach that method to him. How could Gui Shou not be happy when he understood this? Seeing that he was happy, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "Although this method is quite profound, it's meaningless to you. Do you really want it?" Gui Shou naturally said without hesitation, "Please grant my wish, Master." According to his past experiences, he'd long since formed an impression that any technique that Luo Fan passed on to him, even if it was just a few words, would surely contain boundless profundities and would surely be extremely beneficial to him. Under such circumstances, how could he possibly believe what Luo Fan said, that this method was meaningless to him? Seeing this, Luo Fan did not say anything else. With a jolt of his heart, he casually pointed his finger. An array of light condensed from endless words shot out from his hand. It directly penetrated the void and rushed into the space between Gui Shou's eyebrows, instantly exploding in his heart. In an instant, Gui Shou experienced an even more terrifying pain than before. The endless words instantly rushed out from all the orifices and acupoints in his body and instantly filled the entire palace. It even faintly spread out of the palace, as if it had turned into a cloud of words that kept surging. These words contained how Luo Fan separated himself from the divine court's heavenly cauldron and how he surpassed the limit with his grade 9 pseudo-saint body. The method to become a pseudo-saint. Such a method was supreme to all grade 9 pseudo-saints. They would even give up everything in exchange for such a method. But for Gui Shou, whose strength was already as powerful as a desperate person, it was really meaningless. He did not possess any pseudo-chaos origin spiritual treasure. So the technique that separated his body from the pseudo-chaos origin spiritual treasure was useless to him. Secondly, he was now equivalent to a desperator. He was already hundreds of millions of times stronger than a level 9 false sage. Under such circumstances, what was the point of breaking through and becoming a false sage to him? However, it was meaningless. Although it was meaningless, but this was the principle behind the Dermic Gate, but also brought great shock to Gui Shou. This made Gui Shou truly feel how profound his divine abilities and means were. Just how profound was the truth hidden within. There was no other reason other than the fact that an ordinary being would have to make so many preparations and make breakthroughs in so many aspects in order to reach his level. After discovering this, not only did Gui Shou not regret his request to accept this Dermic Gate because of the pain, but he also felt an unprecedented sense of relief. He was glad that he had made such a request in the first place. If it wasn't for this moment, his understanding of himself would still be shrouded in a layer of fog. He wouldn't be able to see it as clearly, directly, and clearly as he did at this moment. Of course, this was just a thought in his heart. At this moment, his body was immersed in endless pain. It was as if atomic bombs were exploding in his consciousness one by one, and he felt as if he was being torn apart at every moment, which filled his senses. At that time, The feeling of information that far exceeded the limits of what he could bear exploded in his heart. It was a feeling that his soul and his memories could not bear. This was something that could be seen from the words that continuously churned like clouds that filled the hall and even spread to the outside of the hall. Seeing all of this, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. If one wanted to obtain his extra knowledge and extradermic gate, one would have to endure extra pain. Based on this understanding, he did not feel any sympathy for Gui's show at this moment. With a thought, he casually waved his hand, and Gui's show was directly sealed into a world that he had casually created, along with the endless words that appeared around him that filled the entire hall. In the blink of an eye, the hall had returned to its original peace. Although he did not feel any sympathy for Gui's show's current situation, nor was he worried at all, he did not want to stay in a space that was filled with endless words. After sealing Gui's show into that world, Luo Fan began to slowly close his eyes and relax his body and mind. He began to frantically devour the endless true saint mysteries and great Tao fragments around him. Although the power of his divine ability was not much weaker than before, it should not be forgotten that he had actually just crossed the barrier between the level 9 pseudo-saint realm. However, one must not forget that he had actually just crossed the barrier between the level 9 pseudo-saint realm and the great Tao fragments. In other words, in terms of his body, strength, true saint mysteries, and great Tao fragments, there was still a huge gap between him and the despair realm. Before facing a powerful enemy, of course, such a gap could not be accepted and had to be made up for. As he continued to devour the true saint mysteries and great Tao fragments, his cultivation realm began to rise continuously, and he continued to get closer to the level of the despair realm. Of course, this speed was actually not fast at all. One had to know that compared to ordinary pseudo-saints, despaired ones were much more powerful. If he wanted to really step into that level, the amount of work that he needed to do was unimaginable. During this process, his mind had entered the origin of the realm, and he was also trying his best to comprehend the true saint mysteries. He was trying his best to turn the true saint mysteries into his own and become a part of the principles that he could control. For the current Luo Fan, although he only needed to constantly improve his worldview, he would naturally be able to become a true saint one day. And he did not need to be like an ordinary despair realm cultivator. He could only rely on constantly comprehending the true saint mysteries to improve his cultivation realm. One could only rely on continuously comprehending the profound mystery of a true sage to raise their cultivation realm and finally cross the endless distance to reach the true sage stage. However, this did not mean that he did not need to comprehend the true saint mysteries. On the contrary, the principles and mysteries of the true saint mysteries were also extremely important to his improvement. In contrast, his worldview was the foundation that was deeply rooted in the ground, and these true saint mysteries were the branches and leaves on the ground. A big tree. The foundation was undoubtedly the most important thing. However, without the branches and leaves, it would be difficult for this foundation to continue to grow in the process of Luo Fan's continuous comprehension and continuous improvement. Time passed slowly, unknowingly. A few months had already passed. On this day, in this palace, there was a faint sound of thunder coming from the void. This kind of thunder was only indiscernible at first, but gradually became so loud and obvious that it almost shook the entire palace. During this period, only a few dozen breaths had passed. Such a change made Luo Fan recover from the process of constantly improving his cultivation realm. At this moment, compared to a few months ago, the true saint mysteries and great Tao fragments in his body had reached a level that was only one step away from being on par with the desperate ones. From his point of view, it was obvious that everything in his body and mind had reached the level of the desperate ones. Compared to a few months ago, his strength had obviously increased by more than 100 times. At this time, if he released the Divine Court Heavenly Cauldron from his body, Gui's show and the others would no longer have the feeling that Luo Fan was weak like before. Instead, they would feel that he had become unprecedentedly powerful and real. The strength of one's own flesh and blood was obviously completely different from the strength of a magic treasure. Have you finished absorbing it? Luo Fan felt the existence of the thunder and looked at a certain position in the palace. There was a world that he had casually opened up. Right at this moment, the sound of thunder exploded. Then the entire palace began to shake violently. In the blink of an eye, countless fragments of the world burst out, and a figure directly appeared there. It was Guizhou. At this moment, compared to the past, Guizhou did not change at all. The countless characters that originally lingered on his body had completely disappeared, as if they had never appeared. Did you gain anything? Luo Fan asked faintly. Hearing Luo Fan's words, Guizhou showed a smile on his face and said, I gain a lot. Thank you, Master, for imparting the technique. Oh, you've actually gained something. Why don't you show me? Luo Fan was quite curious and asked. At this time, he was really curious about what exactly Guizhou had gained. Guizhou showed a difficult expression and said, Well, although I have gained something, I still don't have enough strength to show it. Master, please give me a few days. Naturally, Luo Fan did not have any objection to this. He nodded and asked Guizhou to test it before showing it to him. Guizhou retreated with a face full of shame. After leaving the palace, Guizhou sighed and said, It's really difficult to show it. Looks like I'll have to find a good world to carefully test this method. Previously, through the technique that Luo Fan imparted to him, he had indeed gained a lot. However, this kind of gain only deepened his understanding of himself. It allowed him to have deeper control over his body, and he became more and more able to do as he pleased. It was almost to the point where it could only be understood but could not be explained. If he wanted to show it specifically, he really did not have enough strength. If he wanted to display a method that could be displayed to Luo Fan, it was obvious that he had to deepen his control over his own body, deepen his understanding of his own design and other changes, and finally create a magical ability or method that he could not create in the past and that he could not display. And this, obviously, needed time. However, even if it needed time, it was still a happy thing for Guizhou. All along, he had been reaping benefits from following Luo Fan, and everything he did seemed to be within Luo Fan's expectations. It was not easy for a change that could surprise Luo Fan, and it was not easy for Luo Fan to be interested in something. At this time, he was full of motivation. With a thought, he directly lifted his foot and strode forward. With the help of the change of time and space, his figure had crossed a distance of tens of thousands of miles in the blink of an eye, directly arriving outside the civilized country. This place turned out to be a swamp. Originally, there had been a large number of living beings living here. However, at this time, because of the attraction of the civilized country and the inexplicable barrier, the number of creatures here was almost non-existent. There was no one that could pose a threat to Guizhou at all. After arriving here, Guizhou's eyes shone inexplicably. Then, he suddenly raised his hand. He threw a punch at the void. In an instant, his punch directly blasted out a large mass of dazzling light in the void. In this light, the earth, water, fire, and wind began to surge. Time, space, matter, and energy began to be born out of thin air. They began to follow some extremely complicated rules. The incomparably mysterious rules began to be constructed. Gradually, it formed an extremely mysterious and powerful world. A mysterious and boundless world was born. This world was the first world that Guizhou had opened up. In fact, it could also be said to be a small method that he had comprehended from the method that Luo Fan had taught him. After all, for the creatures in this world, the method of constructing a world with the 4 basic existences was an extremely novel method. Without the method that Luo Fan had taught him, he would not have been able to construct it so easily and skillfully. However, such a small method was, after all, just a small method. Although he could open up a world, it was naturally far from enough to show his gains to Luo Fan and how many benefits he had obtained in the process. It was precisely because of this that Guizhou did not directly use this little trick in the palace. Instead, he directly came here and used this little trick to open up a world. In the end, he planned to enter this world and comprehend a technique that could truly reflect his gains. This world that had been opened up was extremely perfect, but it was also extremely barren. The creatures that existed in this world were all creatures without intelligence. However, similarly, the appearance of these creatures was completely different from the creatures in this world that Guei Shou was in. One could even say that there was no resemblance at all. This was a living being that had evolved naturally from the great Tao of this world and the rules and laws of this world. Guei Shou himself did not exert any influence on them at all. He did not deviate these creatures in the direction that he wanted them to go. Due to this reason, the species of creatures in this world and the living methods of these creatures were extremely perfect and natural. It looked like a natural world instead of a world that was opened up by a creature. This was the first time Guei Shou used this small method that he had comprehended from a method. He could clearly feel the profoundness of this small method. An inexplicable smile appeared on his face. He had even more expectations for the method that he would be able to create in the future. As he smiled, he lifted his foot and stepped into that world. In an instant, he felt as though time had changed. The flow of time in that world was tens of thousands of times faster than the flow of time in the outside world. For Guei Shou, it was extremely impolite for him to not be able to fulfill Luo Fan's request on the spot. Instead, he had to wait for a period of time before he could perfect it. Under such circumstances, how could he dare to let Luo Fan wait for too long? Therefore, during the process of opening up this world, his instinctive inclination was to make the flow of time in this world faster than the flow of time in the outside world. In other words, it was tens of thousands of times faster than the flow of time in the outside world. Under such a fast flow of time, he had a lot of time to open up the method that he needed, and it could also shorten the time that Luo Fan had to wait as much as possible. Feeling the change in the flow of time, Guei Shou heaved a sigh of relief. Then he went to a swamp in this world and drove away the creatures there. Then he sat cross-legged on the swamp and closed his eyes. His mind began to reverberate with a new understanding and control of himself that he had gained after being taught the method by Luo Fan. For a moment, countless inspirations emerged in his mind. After Guei Shou left, Luo Fan, who was in the hall, had an inexplicable smile on his face. At first, he was indeed a little doubtful about what Guei Shou had gained. But what kind of person was he? Very soon, he had already figured out what Guei Shou had gained. The reason why he wanted Guei Shou to use that kind of gain was because he wanted to see how the native creature in Guei Shou's mind would transform it into a method that could be used. How profound would the method that he had created be? I'm actually looking forward to it, he thought to himself. With this thought in his mind, he began to slowly immerse himself in his original plan. He began to absorb the true saint mysteries and the great Tao fragment again. He continued to work hard to improve himself so that he could be compatible with the level of the desperate ones. Time passed by quickly. Unknowingly, several years had passed. On this day, Luo Fan's body trembled. All of a sudden, an indescribable feeling of following one's heart rose in his mind. Then, he felt that what he could enter, it was the origin of the realm. It instantly produced an inexplicable suction force. It began to attract him to the depth of the origin of the realm. This kind of moving speed was extremely fast, and the strength was extremely strong. It was almost in the blink of an eye. He had already crossed a long distance and directly broke through the layers of barriers. He came to a completely unfamiliar place. The combination of the true saint mysteries around him was also many times more complicated than where he was originally. Vaguely, it actually had the same inexplicable characteristic that he could enter now. Among them, any combination of the true saint mysteries also had the characteristic of the true saint divine ability. Finally, at this moment, such a thought suddenly flashed in Luo Fan's mind. This kind of change was clearly the embodiment of him entering the level of the desperate ones. It was precisely because he had entered the level of the desperate ones that his body and mind began to experience the pressure of the origin of the realm. and this kind of pressure naturally weakened the desire of the essence of life for the origin of the realm. Naturally, it made him begin to instinctively start to go to the depth of the origin of the realm. In the end, it formed the situation at this moment. Looking at the incomparably complicated combination of the true saint mysteries around him, Luo Fan could not help but reveal a smile. Although he had also entered the depth of the origin of the realm in that inexplicable place, compared to that inexplicable place, Luo Fan was more concerned about the depth of the origin of the realm. There was no other reason other than that he could clearly remember everything that he had gained in the origin of the realm. The improvement that he had obtained here was his real improvement. It could directly be converted into his strength, and it could even be converted into the real impetus for him to become a true saint. However, it was different in that inexplicable place. In that inexplicable place, he had entered an endless depth. In that inexplicable place, he had already comprehended all the true saint mysteries. Once he left that place, he would still not remember anything, and all the gains would still be instantly taken away. Only the perfection of the worldview could be preserved. Comparing the two, was there a need to say more about which one he should pay more attention to? Since it was rare for him to enter this place, Luo Fan greedily comprehended all the combinations of the true saint mysteries around him. He tried his best to remember all the combinations. The complexity of these combinations had reached the point that every combination was a true saint divine ability. This undoubtedly meant that memorizing these combinations was equivalent to mastering a true saint divine ability. However, at the same time, the gains after memorizing these combinations meant that it was extremely difficult to remember these combinations. Even for Luo Fan, it was still extremely difficult for him to remember any one of these countless combinations. It was still not something that he could do in a short period of time. Soon, Luo Fan had already recognized the difficulty. He stopped looking around and began to lock onto one of the combinations. He began to carefully memorize this combination. After all, Luo Fan was Luo Fan. Although it was extremely difficult to memorize a true saint divine ability, he still managed to memorize one combination after a few days. The moment he memorized this combination, he smiled slightly. His figure directly left the origin of the realm and returned to the palace. Chapter 1577. Fawn, color equals red, squinting eyes face be in the blink of an eye, a seal appeared out of thin air in the direction he was pointing at. This seal naturally emitted an indescribable suppressive power. This suppressive power was different from the suppressive power of the heavenly cauldron of the divine court. The suppressive power of the heavenly cauldron of the divine court was absolute and incomparably pure. However, the suppressive power of the seal in front of him was more unpredictable and all-encompassing. Under this suppressive power, any existence, anything, even if it was a true sage or a person in despair, would naturally undergo various corresponding changes and completely suppress it. This was also the characteristic of a true sage theurgy. Under the seal, the space-time in the palace seemed to have turned into a piece of paper. Everything was flattened by the incredible suppressive power. As Luo Fan thought about it, the seal naturally produced all kinds of subtle changes. Under this subtle change, the space-time in the palace also produced corresponding changes. Many mysterious worlds naturally formed here, turning this palace into the void between the heavens and the infinite worlds. As Luo Fan sat there with his legs crossed, it was like he was the center of the myriad worlds. It was as if everything was revolving around him. Carefully sensing the changes of this theurgy, Luo Fan had truly confirmed the power of the combination of true sage mysteries that he had memorized from the origin of the realm. At least for now, it's not much different from a true sage theurgy. Although the changes may not be as detailed as a true sage theurgy. He thought to himself. Just as he was thinking about this, suddenly, he sensed a powerful aura shooting towards this civilized country from afar without any concealment. This aura was much more powerful than the aura of any living creature that Luo Fan had sensed since he entered this world. Moreover, it was much more agile. Could this be the so-called elder brother of that creature? This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind at this moment. Just then, he suddenly frowned, because he suddenly felt that the direction in which the aura was coming from happened to pass through the world created by Gui's show. As expected, at this moment, a strong fluctuation came from the direction of the world created by Gui's show. This ripple shook time and space. In a trance, even the space within a radius of tens of thousands of miles started to shake violently. Moreover, faintly, amidst the fluctuations, there is also an indescribable aura of destruction. This kind of aura of destruction could only be emitted when some kind of extremely deep destruction was going on. With such an aura, it was almost certain. Now, the world created by Gui's show had been destroyed. After all, Gui's show had already surrendered to him. Luo Fan naturally couldn't watch him encounter danger without doing anything. With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. In the blink of an eye, he had already crossed time and space and arrived at the location where the Gui show created the world. The world created by Gui show had completely disappeared. The shockwaves produced by the destruction of the world were still lingering in this place. The fragments of the world seemed to have turned into smoke, spreading out from this place. At this moment, Gui show was floating in the void with an extremely ugly look. There was a faint illusory shadow wrapping around him. The silhouette of this shadow was exactly the same as him. However, its essence was extremely illusory, as if it could assimilate everything into an illusory illusion. In front of him, there was a flood dragon. This flood dragon had a single horn, and the scales on its body were neat. It looked majestic and ferocious. What the flood dragon exuded was what Luo Fan had sensed in the palace. It was the most powerful aura he had ever seen since he entered this world. Little guy, you have the aura of my unfilial brother. It seems that you have been in contact with him. Can you tell me where my unfilial brother is now? The flood dragon said lightly to Gui Shou. At this time, Gui Shou looked stern and said, "You destroyed the world I created just to ask this question? Oh, that was the world you created, but I didn't know about it. I thought you were imprisoned there. Since it was you who created the world, I apologize," said the flood dragon. Hearing this, Gui Shou roared. "Do you know that I was about to finish it? Because of your disturbance, I had to start over. Now you want to send me away with just an apology?" Hearing such a roar, the flood dragon frowned and said, "Little guy, don't push your luck." Gui Shou sneered and shouted. The illusory outline around his body began to move in an instant. He suddenly raised his hand into the shape of a claw. It was as if he had pierced through time and space, as if he didn't need any time at all. He had already arrived above the flood dragon's head and directly dug into the flood dragon's eyeballs. "I'll apologize too," Gui Shou shouted as he fiercely dug his fingers into the wall. From the looks of it, it was obvious that it wanted to gouge out his eyeballs and then send the flood dragon away with an apology. Seeing this, the flood dragon snorted angrily. From that inexplicable place, a trace of inexplicable power was directly guided down by him. In a flash, it had already condensed into a palm and grabbed the palm of the illusory figure formed by the power guided by Gui Shou. With a poof, a shock wave that shook time and space spread in all directions from the point of contact between the two. The illusory palm suddenly collapsed completely at this moment. Along with the collapse of the illusory palm, half of the illusory figure on the surface of Gui Shou's body also collapsed. But the palm formed by the opponent's power was only a little illusory. From such a change, one could tell how big the gap between the turtle and this creature was. This process seemed slow, but in fact, it happened extremely fast. But in reality, it happened extremely quickly. At this time, Luo Fan's figure condensed in this position. With Luo Fan's experience, there was no need to mention anything else. At this moment, he had already seen everything that was happening here clearly, and he understood everything clearly. For a moment, there was an indescribable shock in his heart. It can actually divide the power that can only be guided once into countless parts and guided in sections. The strength of the flood dragon in front of him was something that he had never thought of before, even if it was the power that Luo Fan could guide down now. He could only guide all of it at once. If he wanted to truly divide the power into countless parts and guide it down strand by strand, he would need to study it countless times before he could do it. Under such circumstances, the flood dragon in front of him could actually do this. This was really unexpected to him. It seems the truly powerful creatures in this world are much more powerful than I imagined. Luo Fan thought at this moment. At this moment, the flood dragon had already seen Luo Fan. For a moment, an inexplicable fierce light flashed in its eyes. Obviously, it felt from Luo Fan a stronger aura that belonged to its brother than that of Gui Shou. Such a strong aura. It seems that my unfilial brother is now with you. The flood dragon stared at Luo Fan and said. At this moment, it had completely forgotten about Gui Shou. Although Gui Shou was stronger than the ordinary creatures born with intelligence in this world and could absolutely crush them in comparison, for it was only a little special. However, to it was just a little special, and it wasn't enough to move it. In contrast, the Luo Fan in front of him, even though it could not see through him, was enough to greatly interest it. Not to mention that Luo Fan had such a strong aura that belonged to its brother. Are you talking about him? Luo Fan took out a magic treasure and said calmly. The flood dragon did not see the magic treasure clearly. Just by sensing the aura of the magic treasure, it suddenly roared angrily. You killed him? Then a powerful and unparalleled power was guided down from that inexplicable place. In the blink of an eye, it directly turned into a huge palm above the void, directly pressing down on Luo Fan. This palm was so powerful and so vast that it seemed to blot out the sky and cover the sun. It seemed like the entire world was enveloped by this palm, and it seemed like the entire world couldn't withstand a light crush from this palm. Faintly, there was an indescribable coldness coming from this palm. This coldness caused everything in this world, including the true divine mysteries, the great path fragments, and even Luo Fan and Gui Shou, to gradually turn into ice and snow. It's stronger than that creature. At this moment, Luo Fan had already understood. Although the palm formed by this power was different from the creature that could use its power to turn everything into ice, its performance was somewhat similar. It could also produce coldness. However, in comparison, the method of turning one's body into ice, the true divine mysteries, and the great path fragments into ice seemed a little simple. It was not too difficult to restrict it. However, the power of the flood dragon in front of him was different. It could also turn everything into ice and snow, but it could directly control the nature of the coldness. The changes that it could produce were many times more than turning one's body into ice. In comparison, it was obvious that the power of the flood dragon in front of him was more mysterious and even more unbelievable. Perhaps this is why they call each other brothers. At this moment, such a thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, he made a grabbing motion in the void, and the magic treasure in his hand had already turned into a small figure. It opened its mouth and sucked in the endless coldness and ice and snow around it. The endless coldness and ice and snow disappeared, and the surrounding situation returned to normal in the blink of an eye. Luo Fan and Gui Shou, who were originally thinking about the transformation of ice and snow, had completely recovered, and there were no signs of damage. It didn't even let him go after he died, and actually played with his body like this? Seeing this, the flood dragon was even more furious. Although the flood dragon was powerful, although it was the most powerful creature that Luo Fan had seen since he entered this world, it was still a creature that was born and raised in this world. Naturally, it would not understand things that had never appeared in this world. The treasure spirit of the magic treasure in front of it was obviously a completely unfamiliar existence to it. It did not know how the treasure spirit in front of it was born, nor did it know what its nature was. The only thing it knew was that this was definitely born from the corpse of its brother. In order for such a creature to be born from the corpse of its brother's corpse must have been modified in many ways. It must have played with its brother's corpse. It had such a thought. How could it not be angry? How could it not curse loudly? With its anger, the palm formed by power began to change rapidly, and in the blink of an eye, it turned into a giant head. This head was the head of a flood dragon. After it appeared in the void, it opened its mouth directly. A stream of coldness that could even freeze a person in despair gushed out from its mouth. At this moment, without coming into contact with the coldness, the space within a range of tens of thousands of miles had been completely turned into ice and snow. Fortunately, at this moment, this place was actually outside the civilized country. In other words, it was outside the barrier between the civilized country and the outside world. There was a faintly discernible barrier between the civilized country and the civilized country. Therefore, the civilized country was not attacked because of this, and the ice and snow did not spread to the entire civilized country. This was also a blessing in misfortune. Without this barrier, at this moment, not only would the civilized country have become a country of ice and snow, but all the creatures in the country would have been instantly turned into ice and snow, completely losing their lives. Moreover, if luck was not on their side, even the 30 million worlds that Qing, Yi, and Yuji said they had opened up might have been completely frozen by the existence of this ice and snow, and even the worlds would have been destroyed. No matter how powerful the treasure spirit was, it could not completely devour such a terrifying coldness. At this moment, he screamed. His body suddenly turned into a pocket, and it swallowed the surrounding ice and snow and the surrounding coldness even more frantically. This pocket's swallowing power was several times stronger than when he had transformed into a human, but compared to the endless coldness that was released from the palm, it was still not enough. In the end, the pocket began to gradually turn into ice and snow. Seeing this, Luo Fan knew that his plan to use this magic treasure to deal with the flood dragon had failed. However, he was not disappointed. Actually, he was already extremely satisfied that he could reach this step. After all, the flood dragon itself was thousands of times stronger than its brother. It was already extremely rare for a magic treasure that was refined by its brother to be able to reach this step. He raised his hand and waved gently, and he had already called the pocket back from the front. In an instant, it was gathered into a ball, and he directly put it into the heaven and earth in his sleeve. After putting the pocket away, Luo Fan and Gue Shou appeared under the huge flood dragon's head without any cover, in the boundless and terrifying coldness. For a moment, ice and snow began to gradually appear on their bodies. This kind of ice and snow did not cover them, but transformed together with their essence into ice and snow. Seeing this, Luo Fan naturally did not dare to be negligent anymore. With a move of his heart, his mind instantly connected with that mysterious place, and he directly came to the depths of that mysterious place. In other words, any combination of true divine esoteric mysteries could become a true divine theurgy. After his mind was connected with that place, he did not hesitate to guide as much of the power that he could guide down as much as possible. Moreover, under his mind, this kind of power was directly the kind that could directly turn everything into magma, the kind of power that was completely in line with that cold thought. The moment this power was guided down, Luo Fan's entire body turned into magma. Moreover, this kind of heat seeped out, directly enveloping the surrounding area, causing more and more of the surrounding area to begin to turn into magma. Among them, the position where Gue Shou's body was located was also in the area where the magma spread. However, under Luo Fan's control, after the magma was formed, it instantly turned into a huge fist, directly rushed up to the sky, and fiercely blasted at the flood dragon's head above. After the magma was formed, it instantly turned into a huge fist, directly rushed up to the sky, and fiercely blasted at the flood dragon's head above. The heat emitted by this magma fist was even more powerful and terrifying than that of the creature whose power could turn into magma. It was already able to be on par with that cold. At this moment, the magma fist began to continuously melt the surrounding ice, and then continued to let the true divine mysteries and the great Tao fragments, even time, space, and everything else were all turned into magma. This caused the surrounding world of ice and snow to finally become a world of magma. Faced with such a change, a trace of surprise flashed in the flood dragon's eyes. Luo Fan could also guide this kind of power from that inexplicable place. This was an ability that Luo Fan had obtained after a great deal of effort. But to this flood dragon, it was not the slightest bit of surprise. To this flood dragon, it was not at all surprising. To this flood dragon, all the powerful creatures that he had encountered in his life, almost all of them had this kind of ability. Luo Fan was so powerful. It was really normal for him to have this kind of ability. What was surprised about was that Luo Fan's power was actually so coincidental. It was actually the complete opposite of him. It was actually the magma that countered him. After being surprised, he thought of a reason that seemed to make sense. Looks like it's because your ability is the opposite of my unfilial brother's that you killed him. As he said this, he became even more furious. With a loud roar, the flood dragon's head closed its mouth and suddenly lowered its head. It directly used the horn on the top of its head to stab the giant magma fist that Luo Fan had guided the power to form. At this moment, Luo Fan felt as if there was a world that could assimilate everything into ice and snow, charging towards him like a meteor, crashing into the ground. A violent and ferocious aura rushed towards him and attacked his mind. It seemed as if it wanted to use this method to directly make him yield. At the same time, he already felt that his fist had encountered an extremely terrifying power at this moment. Under this power, countless amounts of magma began to splash around on the magma fist. Every bit of magma was a power that was guided from an unknown place. It was a power that could casually knead the mysteries of true saints and great Tao fragments, as if they were plasticine. Even if it was just a little bit of such power, it had an unbelievable effect. In the blink of an eye, a world of lava was born at every point of contact. In these magma worlds, everything was magma, including the laws, the great Tao, time, space, and everything else. Everything was magma. Moreover, these magma worlds began to rapidly evolve all kinds of incredible magma creatures. They developed at an unimaginable speed, and all kinds of flourishing magma civilizations were born. It could be said that in the blink of an eye, there were already hundreds of thousands or even millions of magma worlds around them. Luo Fan's fist suffered such a great loss at this moment, and the flood dragon's head that was formed from the flood dragon's power also suffered a great loss. In the collision, the flood dragon's horn instantly collapsed. Immediately after, the flood dragon's head also began to rapidly disintegrate, and countless tiny fragments began to scatter in all directions. This was also the power that was guided down from that inexplicable place. Moreover, it was guided down from that inexplicable place in an extremely deep place. It was a power that was countless times more powerful than ordinary power. This kind of power was also enough to change time and space and change everything. As a result, at this moment, after the bits of power splashed in all directions, mysterious worlds of ice and snow were naturally born at many points where they landed. Each and every one of them was a world made of ice and snow. These worlds of ice and snow were also rapidly giving birth to ice and snow creatures, and they also began to give birth to incomparably flourishing civilizations of ice and snow. It was unknown if it was a coincidence, but there was a magma world around each of these worlds of ice and snow. Very soon, the creatures in the magma world and the creatures in the ice and snow world discovered each other. When it came to an existence whose nature was completely opposite to one's own, or even completely countered one's own, the two of them instinctively produced the emotion of destroying the other. Chapter 1578. A magnificent battle scene unfolded in the void. The world also had its own will. However, that will was different from the will of any other living being, and it was impossible to use the will of a normal living being to guess the thoughts of that will. However, willpower was willpower. Since it was willpower, it had the will to live. Therefore, any world would want to exist as long as possible. It was the same even for this world that was clearly constructed from the shockwaves of the battle. However, the aftereffects of a battle were still the aftereffects of a battle. Generally speaking, they would not last for too long. Under such circumstances, the worlds that were born from the aftermath of the battle would naturally adjust themselves and accelerate the flow of time as much as possible. In this way, he could prolong his existence. This was also the fundamental reason why the flow of time in all worlds formed from the aftermath of a battle was countless times faster than the flow of time in the outside world. At this moment, the lava world and the world of ice and snow were the same. Although Luo Fan and the Flood Dragon's attacks collided and annihilated each other for only a short moment, the creatures and civilizations of those worlds had all developed to an unbelievable level. In the blink of an eye, the war between worlds was already in full swing. In a war of such a grand scale, before Luo Fan and the others could calm down the aftermath of the battle, the worlds had already collapsed and dissipated in the war. It turned into fragments of the world and disappeared without a trace. These destroyed worlds naturally couldn't all be on one side. There was a world of lava and a world of ice and snow. These changes were shocking to those worlds, and they would decide their fates, deciding the fate of their world. However, to Luo Fan and the Flood Dragon, all of this was nothing. But it was a completely insignificant change. None of them even glanced at these worlds. At this moment, the collision between the Magma Fist and the WYRM head had gradually subsided. In the end, Luo Fan gained the upper hand. The head of the Flood Dragon. It had been completely smashed into pieces, and had turned into countless tiny fragments that splashed in all directions. However, there was still about 1/10 of the Magma Fist that Luo Fan had sent out. Although the Magma Fist had been reduced to 1/10 of its original size, its might was not reduced in the slightest. Around the Magma Fist, the mysteries of the true saint, the fragments of the great Tao, time, space, and everything else were all turned into magma. It was still emitting heat that could burn everything. After smashing the head of the Magma WYRM, the remaining lava fist shook slightly, changed direction, and smashed directly towards the Magma WYRM. The Flood Dragon saw the incoming lava fist, feeling the terrifying heat emanating from it that could burn and destroy everything. He opened his mouth and let out a roar. In an instant, countless worlds of ice and snow collapsed, transforming back into an indescribable power. It quickly gathered towards the Magma Fist. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into a palm. In an instant, he had caught the lava fist. It can actually reform after collapsing. Luo Fan could not help but be surprised at this moment. It turned out that once the power of any living creature that he had encountered collapsed, it would naturally disperse. However, this kind of power had never happened before. It had obviously been shattered and transformed into many worlds, but it could actually return to its original form and continue to fight with the powerful power it had at the beginning. It seems that there is still a lot of room to explore in the use of this power. I'm really lucky to have met this living creature this time. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind at this moment. At this moment, the Flood Dragon had already gained the absolute advantage. The powerful power that could turn everything into ice and snow was now more powerful than the power contained in Luo Fan's Magma Fist. Under such a wrapping, it was almost foreseeable that the Magma Fist would be destroyed and the opponent would win. However, Luo Fan did not decide to give up just because of this. At this moment, he manipulated the Magma Fist, and it instantly produced an indescribable change. During this change, the Magma Fist suddenly turned into a huge magma world. This magma world was much larger than the magma world formed by the splashing magma from before. It was unknown how many times stronger it was, even though there were no living beings in it, and it was only an empty world, a barren world. It was a world of desolation. However, the defensive power of such a world was already hundreds of times stronger than the Magma Fist from before. It could be said that after this change, the power that could be sustained by the Flood Dragon's means had increased by at least 10 times. Facing such a change, the Flood Dragon was very disdainful. It said coldly, "It's just a last-ditch struggle." As it spoke, it continued to condense the power that was splashing in all directions, constantly strengthening the power that was crushing the magma fist. It wanted to destroy the magma fist as soon as possible, and then break through its defense to attack Luo Fan, who was behind it. Its movements were so fast, and it was extremely familiar with the returning of the ice and snow world. It did not stop at all. If he was not careful, he might not even be able to see those worlds being converted into power for him to use again. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan's observational skills were not to the extent that he overlooked this. At this moment, he was wholeheartedly observing the entire process of the returning of the ice and snow world, trying his best to understand all the mysteries within. So that's how it is. As the flood dragon converted more and more of the ice and snow world into power, Luo Fan gradually grasped the key to the changes within. An indescribable sense of enlightenment gradually appeared on his face. With a thought, the magma world began to collapse one by one, turning into an indescribable power once again. It began to quickly condense towards the magma world. However, this speed was many times slower than the flood dragon's return of the ice and snow world. Of course, this was partly because this was the first time that Luo Fan had seen this method, and he was still not familiar with it. However, it was more because this method of the flood dragon was actually an instinctive talent. Even the flood dragon itself did not know why. However, it only knew how, but did not know why. When it was used, it indeed contained many mysteries. However, it was mostly due to the natural changes of heaven and earth. The subtleties and mysteries within were absolutely difficult to grasp unless one exhausted his mind and painstakingly studied it for many years. Luo Fan was able to grasp this level just by observing the flood dragon's performance. This was already an unimaginably powerful comprehension ability. At least, this method of his had already made the flood dragon dumbfounded, and it felt as if its worldview had been turned upside down. How is this possible? You clearly did not have this ability just now. How can you suddenly do this? The flood dragon was inexplicably shocked. At this moment, Luo Fan shook his head and said, "It's a pity that the time is too short. Otherwise, I would definitely be able to do even better. No matter how far you can go. You killed my unfilial brother, so you must die today?" The flood dragon's expression changed, and it finally said directly. As it spoke, the chilly palm that it had just condensed, which was completely aimed at the magma world that Luo Fan had condensed, surged with cold air, and with a power that was several times stronger than before, it suddenly acted on the magma world. Crack, 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 crack. Countless shattering sounds came from the magma world. Countless cracks began to spread from the point where the palm and the magma world came into contact. And in the blink of an eye, it had completely covered the entire magma world. Then, the cracks grew larger and larger. In the end, it completely collapsed, turning into endless fragments of the world. It was completely melted by the palm, and in the end, it completely dissipated, turning into nothingness. Although Luo Fan had already comprehended the key to returning the power that had collapsed and changed form to its original form, and regaining control of the key to attack, he had comprehended it himself after all. However, he had comprehended it on his own. Compared to the flood dragon, which was a natural master, at least for now, his speed and strength were far inferior. Under such circumstances, how could the magma world withstand the sudden increase in strength? It was destined to collapse and be destroyed. Go to hell. The flood dragon shouted at this time, and the palm that had crushed the magma world shattered all obstacles and quickly pressed down on Luo Fan. Looking at his killing intent, it was even more intense than it was at the very beginning. In fact, Luo Fan did not have an illusion. The flood dragon in front of him really wanted to kill him more than before. There was no other reason. In the beginning, the flood dragon wanted to kill Luo Fan only to avenge his brother. Under this kind of hatred, although the flood dragon's killing intent was quite firm, it was after all for someone else's matter, and there was always some leeway. But now, because of the powerful comprehension that Luo Fan had shown, the flood dragon had raised its guard against him to the highest level. It knew that if it could not kill Luo Fan this time, the next one to die would be it. In such a situation where its life was at stake, the flood dragon's killing intent was naturally much stronger than before. Before the palm pressed down on Luo Fan's body, the coldness on it had already turned the surrounding space-time into a space of ice and snow. Gui Shou could only exert the method that he had comprehended before, guiding an inexplicable force from nothingness to wrap around his body, and barely isolating the terrifying coldness. However, judging from the power of this technique that had yet to be completely created, the power of the technique that he had been creating these days could be easily seen. At this time, ice and snow gradually appeared on Luo Fan's body. This kind of ice and snow spread extremely fast. Almost in the blink of an eye, his whole body had turned into an ice man. It looked as if he had no ability to resist at all. Seeing this, the flood dragon showed a ferocious smile on its face. The speed at which the palm formed from the power he guided pressed down became faster and faster. Almost in the blink of an eye, it had already reached the top of Luo Fan's head and was about to crush Luo Fan. At this time, Gui Shou was stunned at first, but soon, a faint smile appeared on his face. Of course, he was not happy because he felt that Luo Fan was heading toward his death. On the contrary, at this time, he had already figured out what Luo Fan was doing, so he was not worried at all and was in a happy mood because of this. However, this happiness could not be maintained for too long. Soon, he would have to wholeheartedly resist the repercussions of that palm strike. That cold feeling. However, he had no choice but to use all of his intelligence and unleash all of the potential of the technique he had created before. Only then was he able to barely prevent himself from being turned into ice under the yin chill. He would not be turned into ice and die a violent death. At this time, countless ice blades suddenly appeared on Luo Fan's body. They directly soared into the sky, directly blasting at the palm that was pressing down on him from above. These sharp blades were not ordinary blades. They were ice blades that were formed by extreme compression after the true divine mysteries had been transformed into ice. Inside them, there was an inexplicable power that was also guided from that inexplicable place. In essence, not only was it not weaker than the power on the palm, but because of its compression, its essence was much higher than that of the palm. Compared to other creatures that were born with wisdom, Luo Fan had a huge advantage. That was, as long as he saw any kind of power, he could guide the corresponding power from that inexplicable place. No matter how many kinds of power there were, it was the same. Moreover, no matter how many kinds of power there were, the cooldown time did not interfere with each other. In other words, if he had seen two kinds of power, then he could summon two kinds of power consecutively almost without any time gap. If he had seen three kinds of power, he could summon three kinds consecutively, and so on. At this time, what he was relying on was this special characteristic that he had obtained. The power that could turn everything into magma that he had summoned previously had been dispersed and could no longer be used as an attack. However, he did not need to cool down at all. He could directly summon the power that could turn everything into ice. Just now, his body turning into ice was not the result of the flood dragon's power, but the result of him actively summoning the power. This special characteristic of Luo Fan was almost unique. Under such circumstances, how could the flood dragon have expected it? At this moment, it was even more unable to react accordingly. When it realized that something was wrong, the ice blades had already easily pierced through the palm. With a slight tremble, the palm that was formed by the power was completely torn apart, causing the entire palm to collapse. However, at this point, Luo Fan still did not stop. The fact that the flood dragon could easily condense the scattered power back into its original form had left a deep impression on him. At this moment, Luo Fan continued to attack the power that had been shattered into pieces without hesitation. He continued to tear the power apart bit by bit until he could no longer recognize it. If the flood dragon could still condense the power to attack him, then he could only admit defeat. These changes seemed to be only a few words at this time, but in fact, during this process, The space-time within an unknown distance was almost completely crushed and condensed by the ice power emitted by Luo Fan more than tens of thousands of times. If it were not for the extremely strange space-time structure of this world and the indescribably strong recovery ability, perhaps the space-time within this area would have been turned into paste by now. Faced with this change that was beyond its understanding, the Flood Dragon only had time to shout, "This is impossible." After that, Luo Fan's palm had already slapped on the Flood Dragon's head. In an instant, countless lines and runes flashed, directly forming an extremely mysterious and powerful seal that completely sealed the Flood Dragon, turning it into a statue that maintained a horrified expression. Fortunately, he doesn't know what I'm capable of. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to deal with him so easily. Luo Fan let out a long breath. An inexplicable smile appeared on his face. This Flood Dragon was the most powerful creature he had encountered since entering this world. Its own ability brought him great pressure. He had no choice but to deal with it carefully. Otherwise, if he was not careful, he was afraid that he would suffer a great loss. It was obviously a great thing that he could so easily subdue the Flood Dragon at this time. However, is that organization really so powerful? Any random one of them can bring me so much pressure? As he thought about it, an inexplicable doubt emerged in his heart. As he subdued the Flood Dragon, the world had completely returned to its normal state. Although the terrain and the like had changed a little, but on the whole, it was already not much different from the space-time in this world. At this moment, there was suddenly a powerful force that soared into the sky not far away. In an instant, the space-time above it was distorted. It seemed that there was not much difference between it and the other space-time in this world. Faintly, there seemed to be the light and shadow of unknown things appearing out of thin air. Luo Fan's heart moved, and he instantly knew what was going on. He actually comprehended the key through the pressure just now and created the real method. He turned his head and looked over, and he saw that the turtle's body was currently enveloped by an extremely mysterious force. This force seemed to be substantial, and it distorted the surrounding space-time. It faintly emitted an aura that was similar to the power that came from an inexplicable place. This was a method that used ordinary power to construct it in a special way, allowing it to reach the power that was guided from an inexplicable place. "Master, my method has been created. Master, please have a look." The turtle was inexplicably happy at this time. The appearance of this method did not really strengthen the turtle's instantaneous explosive power. It did not increase his strength by much. However, it could greatly strengthen the turtle's continuous fighting ability. After all, although the power that was guided from an inexplicable place was extremely powerful, it had a time limit, and there was a cooldown time after it was used once. He needed to wait for a period of time before he could use it again. In contrast, although the power of this method might be a little weaker than that kind of power, it had no time limit at all. It also did not need a cooldown time. As long as the turtle's own mind and his own strength could support it, he could naturally continue to use it. This, of course, greatly strengthened his continuous fighting ability. Hearing the turtle's words, Luo Fan smiled faintly, raised his hand to him, and said, "Attack me." The turtle nodded without hesitation and shouted softly. The power that covered his body shook slightly, and a palm that emitted an inexplicable aura was directly condensed in front of him. It directly blasted toward Luo Fan's palm. The inside of this palm was completely nothingness. Moreover, it was nothingness that could erode everything. In every inch of space-time that the palm passed, whether it was the great Tao fragments, the true divine mystery, or even time and space, they were constantly swallowed by the palm. As the power inside the palm ran, they were directly assimilated into a state of nothingness. This performance was very similar to the power characteristics that the turtle could guide from an inexplicable place. Boom! The palm that was constructed by the power in a special way came into contact with Luo Fan's palm. A huge roar suddenly came out. The space-time around the two palms was inexplicably distorted, and it looked like a ripple that was visible to the naked eye began to spread from this position. Compared to the real power, although it is still a little worse, it is already at the same level. To be able to achieve such an effect through the construction of this power, it seems that he has really comprehended a lot of things from the method that I have taught before. Luo Fan felt all kinds of feelings transmitted from the palm, and he had already made a judgment in his heart. Moreover, he had already grasped all the details of this method in an instant. If he wanted to, he could also use this method in an instant and similarly use his own strength to construct any kind of power that he could guide. Chapter 1579. Popular recommendations. At this time, Guizhou naturally knew what Luo Fan meant. Although he was not satisfied, he stopped the next wave of attacks that he had prepared. Luo Fan said with a smile, "It seems that you have really gained a lot. That's good. Take this as your foundation and continue your cultivation." "Yes, thank you for your guidance, Master," Guizhou said quickly. Hearing this, Luo Fan just nodded. Then, he lifted his foot and took a light step forward. In an instant, his figure had already penetrated the void of an unknown number of thousands of miles, and even penetrated the barrier between this civilized country and the outside world. He returned to the palace and reappeared in the seat that he had sat on for unknown number of years. As for Guizhou, at this time, he did not stay in the place where he had stayed for unknown number of years. His figure turned into a conveyance light, flashing and disappearing, leaving a long trace in the void. In the blink of an eye, he had penetrated a distance of unknown number of thousands of miles and arrived at the place where the creature with the born Taoism aptitude that he had created was. For him, anywhere else was the same. It was all about cultivation. In comparison, it was obviously more comfortable where the creature he had created was. After all these years, the creatures he had created had developed to the point where they could come into contact with the civilized country. However, in the eyes of the creatures in the civilized country, these creatures were equivalent to the barbarians. Innately, the creatures in the civilized country already had the charm of looking down on these creatures. Between the two, although there was not much war for the time being, there were small conflicts, but they were continuous. The creatures he had created also took this opportunity to constantly absorb all kinds of knowledge that they needed and all kinds of things that they lacked in the civilized country. In this process, they began to grow constantly. Although this civilized country was led by the creatures created by Qing, Yi, and Yuji, there were not only creatures created by the two of them. There were also other creatures created by the creatures created by Luo Fan who had gained wisdom by refining magic treasures here. For them, the creatures created by Guizhou were equivalent to their own kind. Their appearance, for them, was the growth of their own strength. Therefore, in comparison, they were the friendliest race to them. Vaguely, they actually wanted to form an alliance, to fight against the true protagonist of this civilized nation together. This, as a result, the creatures created by Guizhou grew faster and faster, because it was created by Guizhou. These creatures were born with an indescribable faith in the Guizhou, so they naturally welcomed the Guizhou's arrival. This made Guizhou, who had come here. However, he felt even more comfortable. For a moment, he had the thought of staying here forever. However, Guizhou was intelligent after all, so he reacted quickly. Then he opened up a small world in the forest and went into that small world to cultivate. After experiencing the process of creating the technique, Guizhou was now used to cultivating in the small world. Those beings clearly only had reverence for their creator, and they immediately set up the place where Guizhou cultivated in seclusion as a holy land for their race. The appearance of a holy land for a race was like a tree with roots, like a skyscraper with a foundation. It increased the cohesion of the whole race by more than 100 times. For a moment, the spiritual outlook of the whole race changed dramatically. Finally, after some time, a grand war was waged against the creatures created by Qing, Yi, and Yuji to fight for the position of the protagonist of this civilized nation. In the process of obtaining the position of the absolute protagonist, any race would have to commit countless killings, and they would have to go through mountains of corpses and seas of blood. Therefore, it was obvious that the creatures created by Qing, Yi, and Yuji had many enemies. It could even be said that all living beings of other races were their enemies. The reason why there were no conflicts and wars in the past was that those enemies felt that they were not strong enough to defeat the creatures created by Qing, Yi, and Yuji. But now, with the creatures with the Khanate Taoism aptitude created by Gue Shou taking the lead, how could those creatures not seize the opportunity to rise up? For a moment, the entire civilized nation was plunged into a sea of war. There was chaos and killing everywhere. The various civilizations that had been developed in this civilized nation over the years were like canoes floating on the sea, and they could capsize at any time. Such a war was a great misfortune for the creatures in this civilized nation, but for the controllers behind them, the many intelligent creatures who had created these creatures, it was just a change that could not even attract their attention. Among those creatures, perhaps only Qing, Yi, and Yuji would care about the changes in the situation. The other creatures did what they were supposed to do and did not even pay much attention to the situation. Gue Shou actually initiated a war. It's time to teach him a lesson, Yuji said to Qing, Yi in a world. Hearing this, Qing, Yi frowned. His eyes penetrated the barriers of the world, and he directly saw the changes in the entire civilized nation. After a while, he said, obviously, we still have the upper hand in the current situation. Don't worry. How can we not worry? Although we still have the upper hand, Gue Shou and the others are developing more than 10 times faster than us. They would soon catch up to him. I don't want the creatures we created to give up their position as the main characters and reincarnate as the secondary race of the entire kingdom. Yuji was very displeased. Don't be afraid. Our newly created beings with Khanate Dao aptitudes aren't to be trifled with. They have already started to join the battle. Soon, they will also grow up. At that time, we'll see who grows faster. Qing, Yi had a feeling that everything was under his control. This was something that had never happened before. Oh, I almost forgot about them. Yuji came to a realization at this moment, but his face revealed an excited expression. In fact, she did not have such deep feelings for the creature she had created. The reason why she cared so much about the outcome of this battle was that it concerned her reputation and the strength between her and Gue Shou. Now, since the situation was already balanced, and no one had too much of an advantage, the battle would instead become more exciting. Naturally, she was happy to see it happen. However, it would be better to create more creatures with Khanate Dao bodies. After all, there is strength in numbers. Qing Yi suddenly laughed at this moment. Hearing this, Yuji was even more delighted. This style of doing things was just too much to her liking. That's right. He actually took the initiative to ask Master to teach him a method. We must let him know the consequences of not being satisfied. Yuji nodded. Yuji said, obviously, the interaction between Gue Shou and Luo Fan just now. However, the two of them saw it clearly. They were already feeling all sorts of unpleasant feelings in their hearts, but they could not find a way to vent their feelings. At this moment, they used the battle between the creatures they had created as a way to vent their feelings. They made up their minds. Naturally, they would not waste any time. Very soon, he picked a world and stepped into it. He began to use his own power to create groups and groups of living beings with born Taoism aptitudes. After these living beings were created, he directly connected the world with the civilized country, so that the living beings here could easily cross the barrier between the two worlds once they met a certain requirement. They could directly enter the civilized country and take part in the increasingly tragic war. In the beginning, Gue Shou did not notice the little tricks that Qing, Yi, and Yuji had used. However, as more and more creatures with Khanate Dao bodies participated in the battle and gradually began to occupy more and more important positions in the battle, he no longer felt that all his years of cultivation had been wasted. They actually cheated. Gue Shou did not know whether to laugh or cry when he realized this. He no longer cared too much about the competition between the civilized countries. If Greenwing and Yu did not care about them, he was afraid that even their final victory or defeat would not leave much of a mark in his heart. However, when Qing Yi and Yu actually cheated, Gui Shou could no longer remain indifferent. This was no longer a matter of victory or defeat between those creatures. This had become a matter of pride between him, Qing Yi, and Yu. Fine, I'll play with you guys. With this thought in mind, Gui Shou began to act. However, he did not create more living beings. To him, the rate at which these living beings multiplied was already sufficient for them to cope with any changes. What he did was to summon the creatures with the best comprehension and the strongest abilities into his cultivation world. He analyzed and explained the cultivation system that they cultivated so that they would have a deeper understanding of the cultivation system that they cultivated. As a result, their attainments and abilities would be greatly improved. To achieve this, it was very simple for Gui Shou, who had already consolidated his foundation and created his own cultivation method. After all, the cultivation civilization and cultivation system that the creatures he created developed were at a level that was almost unbearable to him. From his high vantage point, he was naturally able to see the crux of it with a single glance. He knew the essence of these cultivation systems with a single glance, and he knew how these living beings should adjust themselves and how to cultivate in order to obtain the greatest strength and the greatest improvement. Because the war was in full swing, Gui Shou instinctively sped up the flow of time in this world during the process of explaining to them. By the time he spent several months explaining everything and sending those creatures out, only a few breaths of time had passed in the outside world. For those creatures, the whole process was like a dream. They felt as if they had been to a supreme cultivation hall, but it also felt as if they had not gone anywhere. Everything that had happened before was just a dream. However, this feeling could not last long. As creatures chosen by Gui Shou, how could they not have thought of a way to confirm it? After a round of confirmation, they were overjoyed. They immediately began to impart the various cultivation methods that Gui Shou had taught them. In just a few years, the strength of the entire race had increased by at least 100 times. They directly reversed the situation of the war that had been suppressed to the limit. Gradually, they occupied more and more of the territory of the civilized country and became the main character in the civilized country. In other words, the creatures created by Qing Yi and Yu were constantly retreating in the process. When the creatures created by Gui Shou occupied 1/5 of the entire civilized country. In the void, an inexplicable roar was faintly heard. Gui Shou, Qing Yi, and Yuji's expressions changed slightly when they heard the rumble. In the midst of the roar, the three of them faintly felt that this world was sending them some kind of message. The message was so obscure, so illusory, it almost made them feel as if it was an illusion. What's going on? Isn't this just a game of ours? Gui Shou's expression changed greatly at this time, and he thought to himself, the message from the world was so profound that he could not understand it no matter how hard he tried to analyze it. He could only vaguely feel that the world wanted him to win as much as possible. Similarly, Qing Yi and Yu were also inexplicably surprised at this time. Gui Shou's wisdom was higher than the two of them. After Luo Fan's training, his knowledge was also much more than the two of them. Even Gui Shou couldn't figure out the problem, so they naturally couldn't figure it out. Compared to Gui Shou, who could still obtain some information from it, the two of them could not even get the bit of information that Gui Shou had obtained. For a moment, the two of them were a little frightened. After witnessing Gui Shou's transformation tribulation, and witnessing the tribulation that Luo Fan summoned when he split with the heavenly cauldron of the divine court, they had long been filled with awe towards this world. Under such awe, it was easy to imagine what kind of attitude they had towards the information that this world had imparted to them. Qing Yi immediately made a decision and said to Yu, "Let's go and ask Master." Yu hurriedly nodded. Compared to Qing Yi, she trusted Luo Fan more. Even if Qing Yi did not say that she wanted to ask Luo Fan, she would have taken the initiative to say it herself. With this thought in mind, they looked at each other and immediately stepped out of this world. In the blink of an eye, they arrived at the palace where Luo Fan was and asked to see Luo Fan. A short while after the two of them appeared, the void distorted, and Gui Shou's figure also appeared beside them. Moreover, there seemed to be hesitation and doubt on his face. It was extremely similar to them. Seeing Gui Shou, Yuji snorted coldly. Obviously, he remembered the indirect battles that he had with Gui Shou all these years. At the same time, he also remembered that they were at a disadvantage in the battles at this time. Gui Shou could only smile bitterly. Although he wanted to say that they were the ones who initiated it, he still did not dare to be presumptuous in front of his master. Don't be presumptuous. Greet the master first. At this time, the more rational one easily pulled Yuji and said. Hearing this, Yuji reluctantly let Gui Shou go. He snorted again and turned to look at Luo Fan above. At this time, Luo Fan closed his eyes tightly. He sat there like a statue of a god. There were faint wisps of power that swam around his body like spiritual snakes. From these powers, one could feel that they were completely different in nature. There was a great conflict between them. Powers that should not exist at the same time existed at the same time. Moreover, they seemed to be quite harmonious with each other. After a while, all the powers calmed down and condensed into a sphere above Luo Fan's right hand. All the powers condensed in that sphere, chasing and touching each other, and then quickly moving away from each other. It looked like real living beings were testing and communicating with each other. After this, Luo Fan opened his eyes. Seeing that Luo Fan opened his eyes, Qing Yi, Yuji, and Gui Shou hurriedly bowed down and greeted him as master. Luo Fan stopped them and asked, "Weren't the three of you having fun? Why did you suddenly come here at the same time?" Hearing this, Qing Yi and the other two looked a little embarrassed. The battle between the three of them had almost reached a boiling point, but in the eyes of their master, it was just a kind of fun. This made them not know how to react for a moment. After a while, Qing Yi opened his mouth and told Luo Fan what had happened. Luo Fan was originally listening with great interest. When he heard that both of them had received the information, his expression changed slightly. He said, "Show me all the information you have received." Hearing this, Gui Shou and the others did not dare to delay. They hurriedly turned the information they had received into spiritual light and shot it directly at Luo Fan, although they could not fully understand these thoughts. But after all, it was a real piece of information for them. In this way, they could naturally condense this information and transfer it. Just like that, in the blink of an eye, 3 spiritual lights appeared in Luo Fan's hands. Luo Fan's knowledge was naturally many times greater than the 3 of them. Back on the path of transcendence, he had seen so many wills of the world. His ability to analyze the information transmitted by the world was tens of thousands of times stronger than theirs. The 3 of them could not understand the information at all. With just a thought, his perception was sent out, and he had already analyzed everything clearly. After learning the specific content of the information, Luo Fan could not help but have a rather complicated expression on his face. "I didn't expect it to be like this. As expected, the flowers planted intentionally don't bloom, but the willows planted unintentionally grow." Such a thought flashed through his mind. The information told Gui Shou, Qing Yi, and Yuji one thing. The creatures that they had created had the potential to become the true protagonists of the world. As long as they could obtain victory in this war and completely occupy the leading role of this civilized country, the world would give them great benefits. Moreover, apart from giving them benefits, when the living beings they created became the main characters of this civilized country, the world would naturally give birth to living beings with the same structure as the living beings they created and protect these living beings, allowing these living beings to eventually grow into the true main characters of this world and become the true rulers of this world. Even if the creatures were born by the world themselves, they would still respect the winner of the 3 of them as their creators. Although the 3 of them had received the information separately, the content of the information was the same, and there was no inclination. When Guay, Shou, and the others saw the complicated expression on Luo Fan's face after reading the information, and even faintly sighing, they could not help but feel extremely nervous. What exactly was the content that made their usually calm master show such a rare expression? After Luo Fan secretly pondered for a while, he loaded his analysis of this information onto these spiritual lights and sent them back to their owners in an instant. Guay, Shou, and the others were originally very curious about the content of the information. When they saw the spiritual lights being changed and returned, how could they still hesitate? They immediately received the spiritual lights and carefully sensed the information within. Luo Fan's analysis was derived from their level of understanding, so they naturally had no problem understanding it at this moment. Soon, they all understood everything. For a moment, the three of them had extremely complicated expressions. It was still fine between Qing, Yi, and Yu Ji, but between the two of them and Guay Shou, there seemed to be a huge and almost insurmountable chasm that had suddenly appeared. Even the faint closeness in their hearts could no longer be maintained. Even wealth could move people's hearts, not to mention this huge reward from the world and the noble position of the creator who became the true protagonist of the world in the future. In the face of such astonishing benefits, the somewhat game-like war between their creations had completely changed. It had become a real war. If it wasn't for Luo Fan being here, the three of them might have already turned around and personally participated in the battle, instead of just guiding behind the scenes like they did before.